Hey friends. Glad you're here at Super Harry. We've cooked up something special. Harry's Veritaserum proved Hermione was fed 350 control potions by Weasley family for 6 years. Liking and subscribing really helps us out. Okay, story time. Chapter 1, Veritaserum. The interrogation room smelled like damp stone and old fear. Harry had been in enough of them by now that he'd stopped noticing the smell after the first 5 minutes, but tonight it was getting to him. Maybe because the case was getting to him. Maybe because it was 11:30 and he hadn't eaten since the sandwich creature had left on his desk at 2 in the afternoon, the one he'd eaten standing up while reading case files, not tasting a single bite. Maybe because the man strapped into the chair across from him, one Aldrich Knott, younger brother of Theodore, freelance potions dealer, 3 outstanding warrants in 4 countries, kept looking at Harry like he was something mildly interesting he'd found on the bottom of his shoe. "You're wasting your time," Knott said. His voice was very calm for a man in ministry restraints. "Whatever you think I know, I don't think," Harry said, setting the small glass vial on the table between them. "I know you were running controlled potions through the black market for at least 4 years. I know your distribution network ran through Knockturn Alley, 2 locations in Edinburgh, and a rather creative setup in Hogsmeade." He paused. "I also know you kept records, because every potions dealer keeps records. It's professional pride. You can't help it." Knott looked at the vial. "Veritaserum," Harry said pleasantly. 3 drops. Standard ministry procedure in a Category 1 investigation. You've been formally cautioned, and your solicitor, who is, I notice, not here, was notified at 9 this morning. He looked at his watch. Which was technically today, so. My solicitor can file a complaint with the Wiesengemot tomorrow. Tonight, you talk to me. There was a moment of stillness. Then Knott let out a short breath through his nose, not quite a laugh, but close, and nodded once. The ministry restraints held his wrists, not his dignity, and Harry had the uncomfortable sense that Knott was calculating something, had been calculating since they'd brought him in, and had decided that cooperation was the play. The thought was briefly unsettling. Cooperative criminals were always more complicated than defiant ones. Harry administered the 3 drops himself. He always did it himself. Some of the other Aurors delegated it to assistants, treating the administration like paperwork, but Harry had seen too many cases go sideways from careless procedure, and besides, he liked to watch someone's face when Veritaserum took hold. There was something important in it, not satisfaction, nothing as simple as that, but a kind of gravity. This was truth-taking. It deserved attention. Knott's eyes went glassy for about 4 seconds, and then they cleared, and he was still himself but very, very open. "Full name," Harry said. "Aldrich Caspian Knott. Occupation. Independent potions trade. Meaning you sell illegal potions for money." "Yes." "What categories of potion have you sold in the last 4 years?" Knott's mouth moved almost before his brain seemed to catch up. The Veritaserum had a quality to it that Harry had never quite gotten used to, the way it made people lean into answers, like something in them was relieved to finally say the truth out loud. "Class B restricted compounds," Knott said. "Draft of living death derivatives. Befuddlement variants. Compliance blends." Harry's quill was moving steadily across his parchment. He'd brought in his most junior partner, trainee Auror Priya Anand, to take secondary notes, and she was sitting against the wall with her own parchment, scribbling fast. Harry barely glanced at her. "Compliance blends," he repeated. "Define those for the record." "Potions designed to increase susceptibility. Lower resistance to external influence. Extended dosing over time compounds the effect." Knott said it the way he might describe the weather. "Class 3 restricted. Not illegal to make, technically. Illegal to administer without consent." "Who were your clients for the compliance blends?" The list that followed was long, and Harry listened to all of it carefully, noting names with the particular attention he gave to things that might matter later, sorting them mentally into categories: petty, serious, very serious. Most of it was what he'd expected. A couple of controlling husbands whose names he recognized from domestic disturbance complaints. A woman in Diagon Alley who ran a modeling agency. Someone in the Department of Magical Games and Sports whose name he marked with 3 asterisks. And then Not said a name that Harry had not expected, and his quill stopped moving. "Say that again," Harry said. Not said it again. Harry looked up from his parchment for the first time in 20 minutes. "You sold Compliance Blend, Class 3 Restricted, Long-Term Dosing Formulation, to a member of the Weasley family." To multiple members, Not said, with the placid precision of a man under Veritaserum. Over a period of approximately 6 years. The order was consistent. Very regular. One of my better accounts. The silence in the room was absolute. Priya had stopped writing. Harry could feel her looking at him, and he didn't look back. He kept his eyes on Not, kept his face carefully, professionally still, and was distantly aware that he was gripping his quill hard enough that the feather was bent. "Which members?" he said. His voice was perfectly level. Not told him. Harry set the quill down on the table. He looked at it for a moment, at the bent feather and the slight smear of ink on his index finger. Then he looked back up at Not. "Who was the target of the dosing?" "I wasn't told specifics," Not said. "I rarely am. Better that way. But you knew it was being administered to someone without their consent." "I assumed." "You knew." "Yes," Not said simply. "I knew." Harry stood up. He walked to the door of the interrogation room, opened it, turned back, and looked at Priya. She was staring at him with an expression he recognized, the look of someone who'd just seen the floor drop out of something they thought was solid ground. "Keep him talking," Harry said. "I want everything. Every order, every date, every quantity. If he stops cooperating, remind him his solicitor still hasn't shown up and that I will personally ensure the Wisengamot hears about the Edinburgh connection first thing tomorrow morning." He paused. "Be thorough." Priya nodded, already sitting forward. Harry walked out and closed the door. The corridor outside the interrogation suites was long and fluorescent lit and absolutely empty at this hour. Harry stood in it for a moment, not moving. His reflection floated in the dark glass panel of the nearest door, blurry, just a tall man with messy hair and an Auror's robes, and he looked at it the way he sometimes looked at things that needed examining before he could react to them properly. Multiple members. Over 6 years. He started walking. The files were in his office on the 5th floor, a room that had once belonged to Gawain Robards and now belonged to Harry, though he'd never quite made it feel like his. The bookshelves were full but not arranged, the desk was buried, and the one personal object he'd ever brought in, a photograph of him and Ron and Hermione from their 6th year, sat at the back corner of the desk where the light from the window hit it in the mornings. He didn't look at that photograph as he sat down and pulled out the Weasley family file, which he'd only opened twice before, once during a routine post-war assets check and once when Fred's death had needed formal documentation, something that had cost him about a week of sleep. He opened it now with very steady hands. What he was looking for wasn't in the file. What he was looking for was in the evidence archive downstairs, which he couldn't access until morning without waking the night archivist, who was 73 years old and extremely unpleasant about being woken, and who Harry had promised himself he'd never bother again after the incident with the mislabeled Jinx case in 2001. But the documentation, the purchase records Not had mentioned, the regularity of the orders, the timeline, that he could start pulling together. He reached for his mirror. The small, flat one on the corner of his desk that connected directly to the home mirrors of his senior team members. He touched the glass and said, quietly, "Robards." The mirror hazed. After a moment, Gawain Robards' face appeared, older than Harry had first known it, grey at the temples now and wearing an expression that said clearly he'd been asleep. "Potter. This had better be, Not gave us a compliance potion distribution chain," Harry said. "I need you to listen to something before I decide how to proceed." Something in Harry's tone reached through Robart's sleepiness. The older man sat up straighter. "Tell me." Harry told him. The silence on Robart's end was different from the silence in the interrogation room. This silence had weight to it. History. Robarts had known the Weasley family for 30 years. He'd attended Bill's wedding. He'd been at the memorial for Fred. "How confident are you in Knott's testimony?" Robards asked at last. He was under full veritaserum. Standard issue, ministry sealed batch. Priya witnessed. "I administered it personally." Harry paused. He wasn't coerced. He was cooperative. "I think he calculated that giving us the information would buy him leniency on the Edinburgh charges, and he was probably right." He looked at the bent quill still in his hand. He wasn't lying. The target. He didn't know specifics. But the Weasley family's primary Muggle-born associate over the last 6 years, is Hermione Granger, Robarts said. "Yes." Another silence. Outside Harry's window, London was dark and drizzling, the streetlights smearing orange across the wet glass. "In the morning," Robarts said, "you pull full purchase records. You don't touch the Weasley family until you have the paper trail complete. You don't contact Granger until you know exactly what you're telling her." His voice was measured, careful, the voice of a man who had done this long enough to know how badly it could go wrong. "Harry. This is the kind of case that destroys people whether the charges stick or not. You understand that?" "I understand that," Harry said. "And you can handle it? Objectively? Given your history with the family?" Harry looked at the photograph in the corner of his desk. Ron, laughing at something off-frame. Hermione with her arms full of books, looking exasperated and amused at the same time. His own younger face squinting into sunlight. "Yes," he said. "I can handle it." He wasn't entirely sure if that was true, but it was what he'd said, and he would make it true through sheer bloody-mindedness if he had to. That had always been his gift. Not magic, not cleverness, not luck, the inability to stop. He'd never been able to put something down once he'd picked it up. It was a gift and it was a curse, and right now it was very specifically a problem, because what he had picked up tonight was something that couldn't be set back down. He stayed in his office until 4 in the morning, pulling threads. The evidence archive opened officially at 7. Harry was there at 5 past, carrying 2 cups of coffee, one for himself and one for Evangeline March, the archive archivist, who was not 73 and was not unpleasant and who regarded Harry's early arrivals with a resigned professionalism that he respected enormously. She was already at her desk, reading something that she turned face down when he came in. "Not case," Harry said, setting a coffee beside her. "I need purchase records, distribution logs, anything tagged Class 3 compliance compounds, last 7 years. Evangeline looked at him over her glasses. She had very precise brown eyes and the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by what horrors brought her early in the morning. "How wide a net?" "Start narrow. Single supplier, single buyer chain. Cross-reference with financial transactions, Owl Post records, any associated addresses in the southwest of England." He paused. "Ottery St. Catchpole, specifically." Her eyes didn't change. She was far too professional for that. "Give me an hour," she said, reaching for her coffee. He gave her 45 minutes, during which he sat in the archive anteroom and read through Knott's preliminary statement. Priya had stayed until 2 in the morning and had been thorough, meticulous, exactly what he'd asked for, and made notes, and thought about Hermione. He thought about her very carefully, the way he'd been trying not to since approximately 11:47 the previous evening. He had known Hermione Granger since he was 11 years old. He knew the way she sounded when she was excited about something, that slightly breathless, rapid-fire quality her voice took on. He knew she had cried in the bathroom after their first encounter with the troll and then come out and lied about it to protect him and Ron. He knew she had once punched Draco Malfoy in the face in 3rd year and that she had looked, for about one shining second afterward, completely free. He knew that for most of the last 6 years she had seemed tired. Dimmer, somehow. Like a lamp running on reduced power. He'd thought it was the aftermath of the war, the weight of everything they'd been through. He'd thought it was adulthood, the way adulthood ground people down a bit. He'd thought, and this was the part that sat in him like something cold, he'd thought it was Ron. Not in a bad way. Just that the relationship had made her quieter, more domestic, less Hermione, and he told himself that was her choice, that was love, that he didn't understand it but respected it. The thought that it might not have been a choice at all made him feel something he didn't have a clean name for. Evangeline appeared in the doorway. Potter. Her voice was odd. Not alarmed, she was never alarmed, but carefully controlled in a way that meant she'd found something. You should come and look at this. The records were meticulous. That was the first thing Harry noticed, and it was the thing that made his stomach drop the hardest, because meticulousness implied intent, implied planning, implied that someone had approached this the way you'd approach a project. Not an impulse, not a single bad decision in a moment of desperation, a system. The purchase records showed 43 separate transactions over 6 years, all traced back through 2 intermediary accounts to a source that linked unmistakably to Weasley family finances. The potions had been ordered in small, regular quantities, never enough to trip a single-order alarm. Class 3 compliance compounds were not illegal to purchase in small quantities, they were used, technically, in certain legal formulations, though the specific blend Not had been supplying was distinctly non-standard. Someone had done their research. Someone had known exactly how much to order, how frequently, how to keep each individual transaction below the threshold that would flag a review. 350 doses. Evangeline had done the math for him, quietly, without being asked. She'd set the figure on a separate piece of parchment, and Harry had stared at it for a long time. Over 6 years, he said. That's roughly once every 6 days. Give or take. Evangeline paused. Someone who was eating with her frequently. Regularly. As a matter of routine. He thought about the Weasley family kitchen. The enormous wooden table. Sunday dinners. The way Molly always insisted Hermione eat more, always pressed food and drink on her with that particular warmth that Harry had always found comforting and now found something else entirely. He thought about school holidays spent at the Burrow. Christmas dinners. Birthdays. All those years of warm, crowded, Weasley food. He set the parchment down. He picked up his quill. He wrote Hermione's name at the top of a fresh sheet and below it wrote, medical evaluation first. Before anything else. She needs to know from me. I need a healer, he said. Specifically one certified in long-term potions exposure. Someone we can trust. St. Mungo's has a specialist in coercive potions cases, Evangeline said. Healer Orinthia Wells. She's done 3 cases for us in the last 2 years. She's good. Contact her this morning. Tell her I'll need a full assessment done today, confidentially, and that I'll explain context when we meet. He stood up. He felt very calm, which he recognized as the calm that came from having too much to feel and not enough room to feel it yet. He would deal with that later. Right now there was a procedure, and the procedure would hold him together. Seal this file. Only you, me, Robards, and the healer see it until I say otherwise. Understood. He walked to the door of the archive, stopped, and turned back. Evangeline. Thank you. She looked at him steadily. Find out everything, she said. That's thanks enough. He found Hermione at the ministry. She worked 2 floors above him in the department for the regulation and control of magical creatures, head of the Beast Division, which she'd taken over at 23 and turned into something that actually functioned. He walked up to her floor at 8:15, before most people had arrived, and found her already at her desk with 3 reports open and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow, which was the most reliably, characteristically Hermione sight he had ever seen, and for just a moment the cold thing in his stomach tightened sharply. She looked up when he came in. She had that quality she'd always had of clocking his face very quickly. "Harry." She sat up straighter. "What's happened? You look like you haven't slept." "I haven't." He came in and closed the door behind him. He sat down across from her desk. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly even if the answer sounds strange." She'd put her quill down now. She was watching him with the focused, precise attention she gave to things that worried her. "All right. In the last few years, the time you spent at the Burrow, meals with the Weasleys, did you ever feel off? Foggy? Less yourself? Like your thinking was slower than it should be?" The silence that followed was very careful. He watched her face, and he saw something move across it, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. The particular recognition of something you've been carrying so long you'd stopped identifying it as separate from yourself. "Sometimes," she said slowly. "When I was at the Burrow specifically, I thought it was just the atmosphere. Being around so many people. I thought," she stopped. Started again. "After visits, I'd sometimes feel like I'd been," she pressed her lips together. "Foggy is the right word. I assumed it was social exhaustion. Did it affect your work? Your spell casting?" She was very quiet for a moment. "There were periods," she said carefully, "where my magic felt muted. Less responsive. I thought I was overtired. I thought it was stress from the war's aftermath." She looked at him. "Harry, why are you asking me this?" He looked at her. At this woman who had kept him alive through sheer force of will more times than he could count. Who had fought in a war at 17 and had never, not once, let it make her less than herself. Who had been so relentlessly, magnificently herself all her life, and who had spent the last 6 years seeming somehow, reduced. He told her, carefully and completely, everything Nott had said. Then he told her about the purchase records. Then he told her about the math Evangeline had done on a separate piece of parchment. He watched her face as he spoke and he didn't look away from it, because she deserved to be looked at while she heard this. Not spared the news or handled gently. Looked at. She listened without interrupting, which was very unlike her, and told him more than anything she could have said. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. 350, she said. Not a question. Give or take. She looked down at her hands, which were folded on her desk. They were very still. Hermione Granger had always had busy hands, she gestured when she talked, she reached for books, she was always doing something, and the stillness of them now was one of the more unnerving things Harry had ever seen. 6 years, she said. Yes. She looked up at him, and her eyes were very bright. Not with tears, with something more fierce than tears, something that was just beginning to crystallize. You have documentation. I have documentation. And you've sealed it. Only the 4 of us know. For now. She nodded slowly. There was a quality in her expression that he'd seen before, but rarely, in the moments before a battle, in the seconds before she did something brilliant and very dangerous, when her brain had caught up to the scale of what was needed and had simply decided. I want to see all of it, she said. Every record. Every date. Every quantity. Her voice was steady, measured, and absolutely lethal. I want to see the whole thing. I know you do. And you will. But first, he leaned forward slightly. First I need you to come with me to see a healer. Orinthia Wells, she's a specialist in coercive potions exposure. Yes, I know her work. Hermione stood up without hesitation. She picked up her wand from the desk, a habit so ingrained she probably didn't notice she was doing it, and she looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has just measured the distance to a very high wall and has already decided they're going to clear it. When? This morning. She's expecting us. Good. She came around her desk, and Harry stood, and for a moment they were just standing in her office facing each other, and the enormity of the thing that was beginning sat between them like weather. "Hermione," Harry said. "Are you all right?" She met his eyes. He'd asked her that question at least 100 times over the course of their friendship, and she'd given him 100 different answers, brave ones, deflecting ones, honest ones, complicated ones. This time she looked at him for a long moment and said, simply, "I will be," and he believed her completely, and it frightened him and steadied him in equal measure. They walked out of her office together. The ministry corridor was beginning to fill up with early arrivals, people with their heads down and their arms full of files, the ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning. Harry and Hermione walked through it side by side, not rushing, not hiding, not looking like anything except two people with somewhere to be. The difference was that when they got to where they were going, the world that everyone else was treating as ordinary was going to crack open down the middle. Harry was already thinking about what would have to happen next. The formal documentation. The family interview process, which was going to be, he deliberately did not think about that yet. The Wiesengemot brief. The way this was going to land in the press once it couldn't be contained, which it wouldn't be, nothing this size ever was. He was thinking about Ron's face. He kept trying not to and kept doing it anyway. He was thinking about Molly Weasley pressing a plate of food across a table at a 17-year-old girl. He was thinking about 6 years and 350 and the word meticulousness and what it implied. Beside him, Hermione walked steadily through the ordinary morning, her wand in her hand and her face composed, and Harry Potter, who had faced Voldemort at 17 and had never once thought of turning back, felt something move through him that was colder than fear and more purposeful. This was not going to stop. He had picked it up, and he was not going to put it down. Chapter 2, 350 Healer Orinthia Wells worked out of a private consultation suite on the 4th floor of St. Mungo's that didn't appear on the public directory. You had to know it existed to find it, which was entirely by design. She dealt with cases where discretion wasn't a preference but a necessity: coercive potions exposure, compulsion curse aftermath, long-term magical interference with cognitive function, and her patients were almost always people who had been hurt by someone they trusted. She had learned, early in her career, that these patients needed a room the rest of the world couldn't easily walk into. She was waiting for them when Harry and Hermione arrived. 50s, compact, with close-cropped silver hair and the calm, watchful quality of someone who had sat with a great many people in the worst moments of their lives and had chosen, deliberately and repeatedly, not to look away. She shook Hermione's hand and held it a beat longer than a standard greeting, which Harry noticed and appreciated. "Ms. Granger," she said. "I've read your colleague's preliminary brief. I want to be clear about a few things before we begin. This examination is entirely under your control. You can stop at any point. Anything you tell me is protected under healer-patient confidentiality unless you choose otherwise, separate from the Auror Office investigation." She glanced briefly at Harry. "Mr. Potter will wait outside." "He stays," Hermione said immediately. Wells looked at her with an expression that recalibrated smoothly. "All right." They sat. Wells had a small office that was the opposite of clinical: low bookshelves, 2 armchairs facing each other, good light from a north-facing window. She had a piece of parchment on her knee but barely looked at it. She asked questions the way good interrogators did, Harry thought, not in sequence, not in the logical order you'd expect, but moving around the thing from different angles, building a picture without announcing they were building one. She asked about Hermione's magical history. Her spellcasting patterns. Periods where her magic had felt different in quality, in response time, in raw output. She asked about concentration, memory, decision-making. She asked, very carefully, about relationships, not romantically, specifically, but about whether Hermione had ever felt, in the last several years, that her own preferences had felt distant from herself. Like looking at your opinions through glass. Hermione answered everything with her characteristic precision, but Harry kept watching her face, and he kept seeing the same thing he'd seen in her office, that particular look of recognizing something you'd stopped realizing was there. Like she was identifying the shape of something familiar from a new angle. There was a period, Hermione said, they were about 40 minutes into the examination, about 3 years ago. I'd made a decision about a job offer. The Department of International Magical Cooperation had approached me about a position in Geneva. International creature rights legislation. She paused. It was exactly what I wanted. I was going to take it. But you didn't, Wells said. I went to the borough for Sunday dinner and by the time I came home I'd decided against it. She said it very evenly. I told myself I'd thought it through. I told myself the reasons I'd come up with at dinner were my reasons. The room was quiet. Were they? Wells asked. Hermione looked at her hands. Then she looked up. I'm sitting here now and I can't find a single one of them that actually holds. They were all about staying. Being present. Not disrupting things. Making people comfortable. She made a small sound that was almost a laugh, sharp and unhappy. Those have never been my reasons for anything in my life. Harry looked at the wall across the room. He was doing it to give himself somewhere to put his expression, because the expression he had was not professional or measured, and it was not useful right now. Wells made a note. She asked a few more questions, bridging carefully into the physical side of the examination. She needed to take a blood sample, run a magical resonance scan, check for residual compound traces and, more importantly, for the kind of long-term markers that indicated extended exposure rather than a single instance. Hermione consented to all of it without hesitation. The blood sample first. A small glass vial, a tiny spell that was barely a pinch, and then Wells held the vial up and said a word Harry didn't know and the blood turned a pale, slightly luminous green. Wells looked at it. Her face didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. That green, Harry said quietly. That's not good. It's not alarming, Wells said, in a tone that meant it was at least somewhat alarming. What it tells me is that there's residual compound present in the bloodstream. Given the timeline of the last dose, assuming dosing ended when regular contact with the Weasley family tapered off, we would expect to see much lower levels than this. She set the vial in a rack. Persistence of this level in the bloodstream after this long suggests the dosing was heavier than standard class 3 application. The blend may have been specifically formulated for extended bioavailability. Someone made a custom formulation, Harry said. That's what this suggests. Which means someone paid extra for it. Significantly extra. He picked up his quill and wrote that down. The magical resonance scan took longer. Hermione sat in one of the armchairs and Wells moved a detection instrument slowly around her. It looked like a compass but read magical output signatures, mapping the shape of someone's power the way a diagnostic spell mapped physical health. Harry watched it and tried to look like he was simply observing and not like every piece of data was landing in him like stones dropping into still water. The instrument glowed amber throughout most of the scan. That should be gold, Wells said quietly, almost to herself. Bright gold, for someone with Ms. Granger's known magical capacity. She finished the pass and stood back. What I'm seeing is suppressed output. The kind of suppression you'd see from fatigue, or illness, or extended chemical interference with magical cognition, Hermione said. Her voice was calm and completely flat. Yes. Wells looked at her directly. You understand what I'm going to tell you before I say it. Tell me anyway. Your magical output is currently operating at what I would estimate to be 60 to 65% of your baseline capacity. The suppression is consistent with long-term compliance blend exposure. It is not permanent. She said the last sentence clearly, with emphasis. These compounds do not cause irreversible damage. As they clear your system, which will take some weeks for full clearance, given the persistence we're seeing, you should expect your magical capacity to increase. You may notice significant changes in the way your magic responds. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Harry was quiet too. He was doing arithmetic he didn't want to do. Hermione Granger at 65% had been one of the most powerful witches alive, and the thing that produced was an emotion he wasn't sure was entirely appropriate but couldn't quite put down. "What does that mean in practical terms?" he asked. "In practical terms," Wells said, "her magic has been operating under a ceiling she wasn't aware of. As that ceiling lifts, she may experience surges. Stronger than intended spell casting. Magic responding before she consciously casts." She looked at Hermione. "I'm telling you this so it doesn't alarm you. What you experience in the coming weeks will be your magic returning to itself. Not a symptom. A recovery." Hermione nodded once, sharply, like she was filing the information and moving on. But Harry noticed her hand, where it lay on the arm of the chair, had curled slowly into a fist. They had lunch in a small place 3 streets from St. Mungo's that Hermione liked, all dark wood and mismatched chairs, frequented mostly by hospital staff who needed to be somewhere that wasn't the hospital. They sat in the back corner and Hermione ate half a bowl of soup and Harry ate a sandwich he didn't taste and they didn't talk for a while. Then Hermione said, "The Geneva position was 3 years ago. Let's start there." He looked at her across the table. "I mean systematically," she said. "I want to map it. Every decision that felt wrong in retrospect. Every time I talked myself into something, or out of something, at the Burrow." She pulled out a small notebook from her bag, because of course she had a small notebook in her bag, and opened it to a fresh page. 6 years. 43 purchases. Roughly once every 6 days. That's a dosing schedule. That's someone who thought about this. "Hermione, don't." She said it gently but without any give in it. "I know what you're doing and I don't need it right now. I need to think." She looked at the notebook. If dosing happened primarily at the Burrow, meals, drinks, food prepared in the family kitchen, then the person or persons responsible had routine access to the kitchen and regular contact with me. She wrote something. "That's the first circle." Harry watched her for a moment, and then he reached into his coat and laid the copy of the purchase records on the table. Evangeline had made him a duplicate before he'd left the office. He'd been carrying it since 7 this morning. Hermione looked at it. She picked it up. She read it the way she read everything, completely, rapidly, not missing anything. He watched her face and saw the moment she reached the financial cross-reference. Saw her eyes stop and then move more slowly. "The account," she said. "Secondary account. Traceable to the family through 3 transactions in 2003. He kept his voice neutral. "We're still building the full chain, but the link is solid. Which members of the family is Knott's testimony pointing to?" Harry looked at her steadily. "I need to be careful about what I tell you before the formal investigation is complete. If this goes to the Wisengamot, and it will, anything you know needs to be through proper channels, not through me telling you over soup." She held his gaze. "Harry. I know. I'm not going to do anything rash. I know that too." He paused. "I'm also not going to insult you by making you wait for information you have every right to." He looked down at the table, then back up. Knott's testimony names 2 individuals. The purchase records are consistent with both. The dosing schedule required someone with access to food preparation and someone else who provided regular delivery. He stopped. "Molly Weasley." "Anne," he watched her face, "the financial trail runs through Ginny." The small restaurant hummed around them. A server dropped something behind the counter, and the clatter seemed very loud. Hermione was very still. She was looking at a point just past Harry's left shoulder. He didn't rush her. He picked up his coffee and waited. "Ginny," she said at last. "Not Ron. Ginny's name is in the financial records. Ron's isn't. Not yet." He paused carefully. "That doesn't mean that he didn't know." She looked at Harry now, and something had settled in her expression. "Not peace, nothing as soft as that. Resolution. He might not have been involved in the buying or the administration and still have known or suspected. She folded the records with precise, even movements and handed them back. You need to look at that. I'm going to look at everything, Harry said. But I need to do it properly, in the right order, or it falls apart in the Wiesengemot and they walk free. He held her eyes. I need you to let me do this correctly. I understand procedure, she said, with a brief glint of something that in a lighter moment might have been a smile. I've read the Auror Handbook. Multiple times. Of course you have. The second edition has a significant error in Chapter 7. I'll flag it, he said. And just for a moment, a brief, human moment in the middle of something enormous, they looked at each other across the table the way they always had, the shorthand of 20 years, and it was steadying in the way that only true familiarity can be. Then Hermione set her notebook down and said, "What happens to me legally? As the subject of the crime. What is my standing?" He pulled his attention back to the practical, which was where they both needed to be. As the victim in a Class 3 coercive potions case, you have standing as primary complainant. Your testimony is central. Wells' medical assessment becomes a formal exhibit. He paused. The Wiesengemot takes coercive potions crimes very seriously since the Imperius trials. 6 years, 350 doses, a custom formulation, that's not a misdemeanor, Hermione. That's a serious criminal conspiracy. What are the sentencing guidelines? For conspiracy to administer Class 3 restricted compounds without consent, over an extended period, to a victim who suffered demonstrable magical and cognitive impairment, he met her eyes. 5 to 20 years. Depending on the bench and the evidence presented. She absorbed this. Azkaban. Potentially. She looked at her soup. She picked up her spoon, not to eat but just to have something in her hands. She pressed food on everyone, she said quietly. Molly. It was one of the things I always loved about the Burrow. You always felt wanted. You always felt like, she put the spoon down. She used the thing I trusted. Yes, Harry said. She used warmth as a delivery mechanism. Yes. Hermione looked up. Her eyes were bright again, that fierce, crystallizing brightness. Then let's make sure the Wiesengemot understands exactly what she used, she said. Precisely and in full. By 4 o'clock, Harry had assembled a working team. Priya, who had earned her place through last night alone and who he trusted not to go home and tell anyone what she knew. Robards, who was handling the Wiesengemot brief from the senior end and who had connections on the prosecution bench that would matter later. Evangeline, who had already cross-referenced the purchase records against 3 years of Weasley family financial statements and found 11 additional corroborating transactions. And one other person, Marcus Trevelyan, an Auror a year above Harry who specialized in conspiracy cases and had the specific skill of following financial threads until they led somewhere definitive. Harry gathered them in his office, not the conference room. The conference room had glass walls. He laid it out methodically. Knott's testimony, the purchase records, Wells' medical assessment, the timeline. He watched them absorb it. Priya already knew, but the full assembled picture was different from hearing fragments at 2 in the morning in an interrogation suite. Trevelyan made a sound at the 350 figure that wasn't quite a word. Robards was stone-faced in the way that meant he was very angry and was choosing not to be, right now, because anger wasn't useful. The financial chain, Harry said to Trevelyan. That's your priority. I want it airtight before we move on interviews. How far back? 7 years to be safe. Any financial contact between the Weasley accounts and Knott's known distribution channels. Any anomalous transactions that might be payments for the custom formulation. He paused. Also look for a potions expert. Someone had to formulate the specific blend. The extended bioavailability Wells described isn't standard. Someone either made it themselves, which requires advanced potions knowledge, or commissioned it. Trevelyan nodded, already making notes. Priya, I need Nott's full testimony transcribed and certified today. Get it to the evidence archive before close. He looked at Robards. Sir, what's our position on the interview order? Go for the periphery first, Robards said. Anyone who had regular contact with the borough who isn't family. Neighbors, delivery people, anyone who might have observed patterns. He looked at Harry steadily. The family interviews don't happen until the financial chain is complete and the medical exhibit is formally filed. We do this so carefully that when we knock on that door, there is no possible procedural challenge. Understood? Understood. And Potter. Robards waited until Harry looked at him directly. Granger is not part of this investigation. She's the victim. She does not access evidence files, she does not attend interviews, she does not conduct any part of this case. Her involvement is as complainant only. If I find out she's been in this room looking at files, she won't be, Harry said. Which was technically true. The files he was going to share with her would be shared at his kitchen table, not in this room, and technically that made it a briefing rather than access, and the line was thin but it was a line. He met Robards' eyes honestly. I understand the boundary. Robards looked at him for a moment longer than was entirely comfortable, then nodded. After they'd dispersed, Priya lingered at the door. She was 24 with a very quick mind and the specific quality of someone who paid attention to things other people missed. How is she? She asked. Granger. She's Hermione, Harry said. Priya seemed to understand what that meant. Right, she said, and left. Harry went to see Hermione that evening at her flat in Kensington, a place she'd taken on her own, after the relationship with Ron had ended 2 years ago, ending in a way she described at the time as mutual and inevitable, and that now, in light of everything, Harry was going to have to revisit entirely. The flat was precisely what you'd expect from Hermione: books everywhere, organized chaos, a desk covered in parchment and a kitchen table covered in something else, currently a half-assembled piece of creature legislation she'd been working on for the DRC. She'd made tea. She handed him a mug and they sat at the kitchen table, and she had her notebook open again. Walk me through the legal process, she said. Step by step. So he did. He told her about the financial investigation, the timeline for formal charges, what the Wisengamot hearings would look like, what her role as primary complainant would require of her. He was thorough and honest, and she listened and asked questions, sharp specific ones that cut to exactly the right places, and he answered them all. It was, in a strange way, familiar, the two of them working through a problem together the way they'd done since they were 11, except that this time the problem was what someone had done to her. Halfway through, her mug of tea lifted slightly off the table without her touching it. They both looked at it. The mug drifted about 3 inches into the air and then settled back down, very gently. Hermione looked at her own hand, which was flat on the table, not reaching for anything. She was quiet for a moment. Then, that's never happened involuntarily before. Wells said to expect it, Harry said carefully. I know what Wells said. She looked at her hand. Then, slowly, something crossed her face, not alarm, not quite wonder, but something in between, the particular expression of someone feeling a thing they'd forgotten was theirs. She turned her hand over, palm up, and said nothing, and the mug lifted again, smoothly and precisely, and came to rest in her hand as if it had been waiting to. The magic in the room had a quality to it Harry didn't have a good word for. Texture, maybe. A slight pressure, like the air before a storm. How does it feel? He asked. She held the mug for a moment. Like something waking up, she said. He nodded. He picked up his own mug and drank from it and didn't say anything, because some things didn't need commentary. He just noted it carefully, the way he noted everything, this woman, recovering herself by degrees, her power returning from wherever 6 years of chemical suppression had driven it, sitting at her kitchen table holding a mug of tea with magic that hadn't been politely requested. Just summoned, because it was hers. We should talk about the pensieve, he said, when the moment had settled. Wells recommends it. Walking through key memories under a diagnostic framework, it would help establish exactly which decisions over the last 6 years were affected. It's admissible evidence if the sessions are witnessed correctly. Hermione set the mug down. Which memories specifically? Any significant decision you made in the relevant period that you think might have been influenced. Career choices. The Geneva position. The relationship with Ron. He paused. The end of the relationship with Ron. She was quiet. I know, Harry said. You don't know, she said, not unkindly. You know facts. What you don't know, what I don't know yet, is how much of those 6 years was me and how much was, she gestured with one hand, a short, frustrated movement. I need to know. I need to look at it clearly. The pensive is correct. It'll be hard. Yes. She looked at him. Hard and necessary are not mutually exclusive. No, he agreed. They're usually the same thing. She almost smiled at that. It was small and rueful and very Hermione, and Harry filed it away in the part of himself that tracked such things without making a production of it. They talked for another hour. By the time he left, she had written 4 pages of notes in her precise, fast script, and she had a copy of the Wiesengemots procedure guide open on her desk, not because Harry had given it to her but because she'd already ordered it from the ministry library that afternoon, which he discovered when he saw the request slip tucked inside the cover. He stood in her doorway with his coat on. Don't go near the burrow, he said. Don't contact any of the Weasleys. Not yet. I know. And Hermione. He looked at her directly. Whatever you find in the pensive. Whatever you figure out about the last 6 years. None of it changes what you are. Not who you were, not who you are now. She looked at him for a long moment. The flat was quiet around her, lit warm against the dark London evening, her books and her notes and her cooling tea, and she looked like herself in a way she hadn't in a long time, sharp and fully present, not dimmed. I know that too, she said. But she said it like she was deciding it, making it true by saying it out loud, which was its own kind of magic. He walked home through the wet streets and didn't take the flu, because he needed the cold and the noise and the rain. He thought about Molly Weasley pressing food across a warm kitchen table. He thought about Ginny and a financial account and a decision 3 years ago about Geneva. He thought about Ron, whose name wasn't in the financial records, whose name Hermione had said quietly, not Ron, the way you say the name of something you're afraid to look at directly. He thought about 350 doses of someone doing this on purpose, carefully and consistently, to someone they called family. The cold settled in him and stayed there, and he let it, because cold was useful. Cold kept him moving forward. Cold was what happened when sentiment had been examined and set aside in favor of the truth. He had the truth. He had the records. He had the healer's assessment. He had a team who trusted him and procedure that would hold. He had Hermione Granger, waking up by degrees, her magic lifting mugs off tables without permission, her mind already several steps ahead of everyone else. The Weasley family didn't know yet that any of this was coming. By the time they did, it would be too late to make it go away. Chapter 3, The Shape of a Cage. The pensive arrived from the ministry archives on a Thursday morning, delivered by a junior clerk who clearly had no idea what it was for and who Harry signed for with the same expression he used when collecting routine evidence. It was a wide, shallow stone basin, ministry issue, etched around the rim with certification marks and a chain of evidence seal. Not the most beautiful one Harry had ever seen, that was Dumbledore's, still sitting in the headmistress's office at Hogwarts, but solid, legally sound, and exactly what they needed. He brought it to Hermione's flat himself rather than having it delivered, and she was ready when he arrived. She'd cleared her kitchen table completely, which for Hermione was a significant act, the books and parchment and legislation notes all stacked neatly against the wall, the surface bare except for 2 mugs of tea and a small recorder orb that she'd borrowed from the ministry's legal evidence department. She'd read everything about the pensieve's use as admissible evidence. Of course she had. Healer Wells was already there, sitting in the corner armchair with her parchment and her calm, watchful eyes. She would observe and document. She would not direct. Hermione had been very clear about that. "I'll start with Geneva," Hermione said, without preamble, the moment Harry set the basin on the table. She was dressed simply, her hair pulled back, and she had the quality she sometimes had before difficult things, a kind of braced stillness, like someone about to step into cold water. That's the clearest example. I remember the decision process very specifically, and I know what it looked like before the Burrow dinner and what it looked like after, and those two things don't match. "Whenever you're ready," Harry said. She was ready immediately. She extracted the memory with her wand, a practiced motion, silvery thread drawn from her temple, and lowered it into the pensieve, and then she looked at Harry and said, "Come on then," and they both leaned in. The memory was warm. That was the first thing Harry noticed, the quality of warmth that the Burrow always had, that specific amber glow that he had spent years associating with safety and welcome. The kitchen was busy, steaming pots on the stove tending themselves, the table already laid with enough food for 12 people though there were only 8 of them for dinner that night. He stood in the corner of the memory kitchen and watched, with the particular dislocation of pensive travel, as a younger version of Hermione moved through the scene. 3 years younger, but the difference was visible even to Harry who'd been seeing her every week. She'd had more brightness then, more animation in her face, though standing here now with the knowledge of what he knew, he could see the edges of it differently. There was a softness to her movements. A slightly unfocused quality to her attention. Molly was at the stove. Large and warm and entirely in command of her kitchen, moving between pots and counter with the efficiency of someone who had fed a large family for 40 years. She was humming. It was a cheerful, domestic sound, and it landed in Harry's chest like a stone. She turned to put a bowl down in front of Hermione. "Eat, love, you look tired," she said, with such complete and practiced warmth that Harry had to look away for a moment. Hermione in the memory looked down at the bowl. Then she picked up her spoon and ate. It shouldn't have been hard to watch. It was just a woman eating soup. But Harry watched the small, systematic thing, the bowl placed specifically in front of Hermione, the particular care with which Molly had arranged the table so that Hermione's spot was stocked, her plate always full, her glass never empty, and felt the cold in him drop several degrees. Ginny was there too. Sitting across the table from memory Hermione with her characteristic energy, talking about Quidditch or work or something that Harry barely tracked, because he was watching Ginny's eyes. Ginny, who was observing Hermione with a quality he recognized now that he hadn't been looking for then. Not malice. Nothing as clean as malice. Something more complicated, the watchful attention of someone monitoring a situation they felt responsible for. The dinner progressed. Harry observed. At a certain point, maybe 40 minutes in, he thought, judging by the quality of the memory's light, memory Hermione's energy visibly shifted. Subtle, the way a sail loses wind, not collapsing but going slightly slack. The brightness dimmed a fraction. The animation in her face smoothed out into something more placid. She was still talking, still laughing at the right moments, still entirely present, but the sharp particular quality of her, the thing that made Hermione Hermione, had turned down. Like a radio someone had adjusted by 2 notches. Later in the memory, the conversation turned to the Geneva offer. Ron mentioned it, he'd heard about it secondhand from someone at the ministry, and the table's reaction was immediate and orchestrated, not in a planned way, but in the way of a family that had discussed this privately and arrived at a position together. Molly said something about it being so far away. Arthur said something kind and well-meaning about how wonderful it was but how London needed good people too. Ron said, with what sounded like easy casualness, that it would be weird for Hermione to leave when things were so settled here. And Hermione in the memory listened, and her face did the thing, the softening, the accommodation, the settling, and Harry watched her slowly, gradually arrive at no when everything about her had been pointing at yes. The memory ended. They came up out of the pensive and Harry straightened and looked at Hermione, the real Hermione, standing across the table with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "The soup," she said. Her voice was completely steady. She always put the bowl right in front of me. Always. She made a point of it. I thought it was kindness. It was deliberate placement, Harry said. Yes. She looked at the pensieve. I want to see the others. They spent 4 hours in Hermione's kitchen. They went through 7 memories in total. The Geneva decision. A career review, 2 years before that, where Hermione had turned down a promotion because she'd felt, suddenly, that she was overextending. A conversation with Ron, about a year into their relationship, where Hermione had expressed serious doubts. Harry had not known about this conversation, and watching memory Hermione slowly talk herself out of those doubts with reasoning that dissolved under the slightest examination was one of the more difficult things he'd sat through. A holiday that Hermione had cancelled, a conference she'd declined to attend, a research project she'd abandoned citing lack of motivation that had been, by every visible metric, the most exciting thing she'd been involved in since the war. After each memory, Wells made notes. Harry made notes. Hermione stood very still, looking at the pensieve with the expression of someone who was cataloguing damage. She wasn't weeping. He'd been prepared for that, for the grief that rightfully belonged to this process, but Hermione was doing something more controlled and in some ways harder to watch. She was locating herself. Going through the memories the way you'd go through a room that had been searched by someone else, cataloguing what had been moved, what was missing, what had been rearranged to look the same but wasn't. She was methodical about it, and the methodology was holding her together. After the 7th memory, she straightened up, rolled her shoulders back, and said, I turned down 3 major career advancements. I stayed in a relationship past the point my own judgment was telling me to leave it. I cancelled a research project that would have been significant. She looked at Harry. I can establish the pattern. The pensieve sessions are consistent. Every significant decision that moved away from my own interests and towards staying within the Weasley family orbit coincided with high-dosing periods. Wells, Harry said. I can certify all 7 memories as evidentially consistent with extended compliance blend exposure, Wells said, without looking up from her parchment. The behavioral signature is textbook in the later instances and present but subtle in the earlier ones, which is consistent with escalating dosage over time. She did look up then. Ms. Granger, I want to say something that isn't in my report. Hermione looked at her. The fact that you maintained your professional capability, your relationships outside the family, your fundamental personality, that's not nothing. Compliance blends of this type don't build compliance from nothing. They amplify existing tendencies toward accommodation and quiet the voice that pushes back. Wells paused. The voice that pushed back was strong enough that it took 6 years and 350 doses to significantly muffle it. That tells you something. Hermione was quiet for a moment. It tells me, she said, that whoever designed the dosing schedule was working harder than they expected to. Yes, Wells said simply. Harry looked at Hermione and didn't say anything, because Wells had said it and it was right and anything he added would be redundant. He just watched her absorb it, watched her file it, watched her stand a little straighter, not because she was performing strength but because something had landed and held. Then she said, I need some air. And then I need to go to Hogwarts. Harry blinked. Hogwarts. Professor Slughorn's old potions library. He left it to the school when he retired and it's been catalogued in the restricted section. She was already moving, picking up her coat from the hook by the door. If someone commissioned a custom compliance formulation with extended bioavailability, they needed either an exceptionally skilled potions brewer or a specific reference text. There are only 4 texts that contain the theory for that kind of extended release modification. She looked at Harry. I want to see if any of them show evidence of recent research. Cross-referencing against the Weasley family, specifically whether anyone in that family had access to the library at the right time. Harry stared at her. You've already thought about this. I've been thinking about it since Wells told me about the bioavailability. She buttoned her coat. "Are you coming?" He stood. "Yes," he said. "Obviously." Hogwarts was quieter than it had been when they were students, though only in the way that all schools are quieter when you come back as an adult. The noise was still there, hundreds of students moving through corridors and across courtyards, but Harry moved through it differently now. The school noticed him too. It always did. Portraits whispered to each other as he and Hermione walked through the entrance hall, and at least 3 ghosts materialized to say hello before Harry politely extracted himself. Headmistress McGonagall met them in the corridor outside the restricted section. She was the same as she'd always been, stern, precise, profoundly decent, and she had clearly had enough of a briefing from Harry's owl to know that something significant was happening, because she looked at them both with an expression that combined academic authority with something considerably more personal. "Granger," she said. Then, more quietly, "How are you?" "I'm very well, Professor," Hermione said, with the particular warmth she reserved for people she genuinely respected. "We'll be better once we've had a look at the restricted potions library." McGonagall held her gaze for a moment. "I'll give you both access. The library has been catalogued since Slughorn's collection was integrated. There's a record of every researcher who's accessed it in the last 10 years. She paused. "I've already thought of the same question you're going to ask, and yes, I've checked." She looked at Harry. "There's a record of access from 7 years ago. Someone used the Fleur to access the school as a visiting researcher. The listed purpose was personal potions research." "The name," Harry said. McGonagall handed him a small card. The handwriting was careful, the name signed in full. Ginevra Weasley. Harry held the card and looked at it. He kept his face perfectly even. Then he passed it to Hermione, who looked at it and handed it back to McGonagall with a steady hand. "Which texts did she access?" Hermione asked. "The record shows 2. A general reference on restricted compounds." McGonagall's voice was very even. "And Fiorelli's advanced techniques in extended-release magical formulation." The corridor was very quiet. "That's one of the 4, Hermione said. "Yes," Harry said. "She did the research herself." "It looks that way." Hermione stood for a moment in the Hogwarts corridor with the torchlight on her face and her hands still at her sides. Harry watched her process it, not the fact of it, she'd already concluded as much, but the detail. The specificity. The image of Ginny Weasley sitting in this library, researching precisely how to make the thing she was going to do harder to detect and longer lasting. "Can I see the text?" Hermione asked McGonagall. "Of course." They spent an hour in the restricted library. Hermione moved through it with the ease of someone who had practically lived there at 17, pulling the Fiorelli text and spending 20 minutes going through it with a precision that Harry suspected was partly investigative and partly something more personal. She was reading the thing that had been used against her, and there was something in her expression as she read that Harry recognized as the look of someone taking an enemy's measure. She found the relevant section. Long-release modification of Class 3 compounds, specific formulation techniques that would embed the active ingredients in food-based carriers, fats, certain herbs, the particular chemistry of home-cooked food, so that they released slowly and consistently over hours rather than minutes. "Sophisticated," she said, without looking up. "Ginny was always good at potions," Harry said, carefully. "She was better than anyone knew." Hermione turned a page. "She's better than she let on. She used standard Hogwarts grades as a baseline, nobody looked past the O she got in OWLs because she didn't pursue it professionally." She looked up at Harry. She was hiding it. Or it just wasn't her focus. "Harry." Hermione looked at him. "She accessed this library specifically to research extended-release compliance formulation. That is a focused, specific research trip with one purpose." She closed the book. She was hiding it. He didn't argue, because she was right. They were back in London by early evening, and Harry had 3 messages waiting from Trevelyan when he checked his office mirror. He called back immediately. Financial chain is solid, Trevelyan said. He looked tired and wired simultaneously, the look of someone who'd been following a thread and found more on the other end than they'd expected. The secondary account traces to Ginny Weasley's personal finances beyond any reasonable doubt. 43 transactions, all to Knott's distribution front. But here's the thing, Potter, she wasn't paying market rate. What do you mean? The amounts are higher than market rate for standard class 3 compounds. Significantly. If you factor in the custom formulation premium that Wells described, the math works out to, Trevelyan checked something. Ginny Weasley spent approximately 14,000 galleons over 6 years on this. Harry sat with that for a moment. 14,000. She liquidated a Gringotts investment account in the 3rd year to cover a larger payment. Her Quidditch salary was significant, but the investment liquidation suggests the cost was becoming a stretch. Trevelyan's voice was carefully neutral. She was committed enough to sacrifice a significant financial asset to maintain the dosing schedule. What about Molly? Molly's name isn't in the financial chain. She wasn't buying it. Trevelyan paused. But the dosing had to happen in the kitchen. So either she was doing it knowingly, or, she was told something that made her think it was acceptable, Harry said. Or she was told nothing at all and simply administered something she was given. Which would put Ginny as the architect, Trevelyan said, and Molly as either complicit or, used. It's possible, Harry said. It was possible, and he couldn't dismiss it, and it made the whole thing more complicated in exactly the way he didn't want it to be more complicated. Keep digging. I need to know if there's any evidence Molly had knowledge of the specific nature of what she was administering. After he ended the call, he sat at his desk for a while. He was thinking about Ginny. About the girl who had been his first serious relationship, who he'd cared about genuinely, who had been brave and funny and formidably talented, who he drifted away from after the war, not through any dramatic rupture but through the gradual recognition that they were growing in different directions. He'd always thought of her clearly, not with bitterness, not with regret, just clearly. She'd been real to him. He was still thinking about her clearly. That was what made it so difficult. She wasn't a monster in the way that monsters were simple, she was a person he knew, a person he'd liked, and she had done this specific, deliberate, monstrous thing. Those two facts sat next to each other and didn't resolve, and he let them not resolve because forcing a false resolution would make him worse at his job. He pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and wrote, at the top, Ginny Weasley, motivation. Below it he wrote, protect Ron. Keep Hermione compliant, present, grateful, within orbit. Prevent career advancement that would move her beyond family influence. Fear that if Hermione became fully herself, she'd leave. He stared at the last line. Fear that if Hermione became fully herself, she'd leave. The worst part was that Ginny had probably been right. Not as a justification, nothing was a justification, not for this, not for any of it, but as a prediction. Hermione Granger, fully herself, unmedicated, uncompromised, would have taken the Geneva position, would have outgrown the relationship with Ron on her own timeline, would have become something so thoroughly and brilliantly herself that the comfortable orbit of the Weasley family would have naturally, probably, expanded too small to hold her. Ginny had seen that clearly. She'd been right about it. And then she'd done the worst possible thing with the knowledge. He folded the parchment and put it in his pocket, not the case file. His pocket. Because it wasn't evidence yet. It was understanding, and understanding wasn't the same thing as proof, but it mattered, because when they got to the Wisengamot, motive would be the thing that made it comprehensible, and comprehensible was the thing that made it real to a jury rather than abstract. He went to see Ron that evening. He hadn't told Robards he was going. He hadn't told Hermione, because she would have asked to come, and this wasn't the right circumstance for that. He went alone, because Ron was his friend, had been his best friend for 20 years, and because he needed to see him in person before the investigation formally reached him, not to warn him, but because he owed it to both of them to look him in the eye. Ron lived in a flat in Islington, nothing special, tidy in the way of someone who lived alone and didn't particularly care about tidiness but had absorbed enough of a certain kind of upbringing to keep things from becoming chaotic. He answered the door in his Cannon's jersey and the particular expression of someone who hadn't been expecting company but was genuinely pleased. "Harry. Come in." He stopped. He looked at Harry's face. Ron Weasley, for all his social obliviousness about many things, had always been extremely quick at reading Harry. "What's happened?" Harry came inside. He sat down on Ron's sofa. He looked at his oldest friend, this tall, red-haired, deeply familiar person, and he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Ron sat down across from him. He didn't joke. He didn't deflect. He looked at Harry steadily, and there was something in his expression that Harry had not expected, not surprise. Not the clear, open surprise of someone who had no idea what was coming. Something more complicated. Something that looked, slightly and terribly, like a man bracing for something he'd been waiting for. "The years Hermione was with you," Harry said. "Did you ever notice anything off about her? Not wrong, not alarming, but different. Softer. Less Hermione," Ron said quietly. The flat was very still. Harry waited. Ron put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that Harry counted the seconds without meaning to, sitting in the stillness, and when Ron finally looked up his expression had the quality of something that had been held in a closed room for a long time and had just been allowed air. "I noticed," Ron said. "I noticed she was," he stopped. "Tried again. There were moments where she'd say things and I'd think, that doesn't sound like her. And then she'd decide something, decline something, or change her mind about something, and there'd be this moment after where she'd look wrong. Not sad. Just, like she'd missed a step in the dark." He looked at Harry. "And I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself she was just settling. Adjusting. That's what I told myself." "Did you ever ask?" Harry said. His voice was very even. "Did you ever ask anyone in your family what was in the food she was given?" The silence was different this time. "No," Ron said. His voice was low. "I never asked." He looked at Harry, and his face had something terrible in it, not guilt over having done the thing, Harry thought, but the specific, grinding guilt of someone who had seen a door and chosen not to open it. "I never asked because I didn't want to know. And I've known that about myself for 2 years, Harry. I've known it was a rotten thing about myself and he pressed his hands against his face briefly. "What was done to her? Tell me." So Harry told him. He told him all of it. Watching Ron's face throughout was one of the hardest things Harry had done in a professional career full of hard things, because Ron was not performing his reaction, it was completely real, visible, ugly in the way that genuine grief and genuine shame are ugly, without the cleanness of pure innocence and without the clarity of guilt. Ron was something harder. Ron was a man who had loved someone and had not asked the question that might have helped her, because the answer frightened him. When Harry finished, Ron said nothing for a very long time. Then, "Is she all right?" "She's going to be," Harry said. I need to, not yet," Harry said. "Not until I tell you it's time." "And Ron," he looked at him squarely. "Your name isn't in the financial records. You're not being investigated. But you are going to be asked questions formally, and the answer you just gave me about noticing something was wrong, that answer, that honest answer, is the one you give them. Do you understand me?" Ron looked at him. "I'm not going to lie about it, Harry." "I know you're not." Harry meant it. For all of Ron's failures in this situation, and they were real, and significant, and the two of them would need to have a far longer reckoning about them at some point, dishonesty had never been one of them. "That's why I'm telling you to tell the truth." He left 15 minutes later. The evening had gone fully dark, and the Islington streets were loud with pubgoers and passing cars and the ordinary noise of London people living ordinary lives. Harry walked through it and felt the weight of what he was carrying shift and settle. It was heavier now, and more specific, and it had the particular shape of something real. He had one more stop. He operated to the edge of the wards around his own house, the house in Godric's Hollow he'd rebuilt and warded and made properly his own in the years since the war, and stood for a moment in the dark lane outside it. He looked at the lights in the windows. He thought about the evening's accumulation, the pensive, the library, Trevelyan's financial chain, Ginny's name on a card in McGonagall's handwriting, Ron's face. He thought about Hermione standing in the Hogwarts restricted library reading the text that had been used against her, with her jaw set and her eyes very clear. He thought about the mug lifting off the table. Like something waking up, she'd said. He went inside, sat at his desk, and began drafting the formal charge recommendation for the Wizengamot. It took him 3 hours. He chose every word with the precision of someone building something that had to hold weight, real weight, legal weight, the weight of what had been done to someone he loved. He filed it just before midnight. The investigation was no longer preliminary. Chapter 4, The Ministry Moves. The charge recommendation landed on the Wizengamot's intake desk at 12:04 in the morning, and by 8 a.m. it had been read by 3 senior members of the prosecution bench, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and, through a leak that Harry had not anticipated but probably should have, someone connected to the Daily Prophet. He found out about the leak when he arrived at the Ministry at 7:30 and found 12 owls queued outside his office window. He stood at his desk looking at them for a moment, then turned to Priya, who had beaten him in by 20 minutes and was already wearing the expression of someone who had been managing a situation since before dawn. "How bad?" he said. "The Prophet has a source inside the Wizengamot intake office," she said. "They don't have names yet. What they have is, Auror Office Files formal charge recommendation involving prominent wizarding family, Class 3 coercive potions conspiracy, 6-year timeline." She paused. "That's enough for someone to start guessing. Who's the intake source? Working on it. Make it fast." He sat down and began opening the owls, sorting them into 3 piles, press inquiries, which went straight to a folder he'd deal with later, colleagues asking questions, which he'd answer carefully, and 1 letter, on ministry cream-colored stationery, from the head of magical law enforcement herself, Astoria Greengrass Malfoy, requesting his presence at 9 o'clock. He read that one twice. Then he put on his Auror robes, the formal ones he kept for hearings, and went upstairs. Astoria Greengrass Malfoy had been head of the DMLE for 4 years, appointed at 36 after a career in magical law that had been, by every metric, exceptional. She was also, incidentally, the person who had restructured the Auror office's evidence protocols after the Imperius trials, which meant she understood better than almost anyone what a case of this specific type required procedurally. Harry had always respected her. He was currently respecting her very hard as he sat across her desk and watched her read through his charge recommendation with the focused, systematic attention of someone doing it right. She finished. She set it down. She looked at him. "The Weasley family," she said. "Yes. Molly and Ginevra Weasley as primary respondents." "Yes. In a Class 3 coercive potions conspiracy against Hermione Granger." She said it evenly, the way you said things that needed to be said plainly so nobody could later claim they'd been obscured. "For 6 years. 350 documented doses," Harry said. "Custom formulation for extended bioavailability. 43 purchase transactions, financial chain to Ginevra Weasley's personal accounts, access records at Hogwarts Library showing research into advanced formulation techniques 7 years ago, Veritaserum testimony from the distributor, full medical assessment from a certified specialist, and 7 evidentially certified pensive memories from the victim establishing behavioral pattern consistent with sustained exposure." Astoria looked at him for a long moment. "You built this fast." "The evidence was there. I followed it." "The victim is Hermione Granger." "Yes." "Who is a close personal friend of yours." "Yes." He met her eyes. "She is." And I'm the one who found it, and I'm the one who built the case, and I've been thorough and procedurally correct at every step. If you want to assign it to another senior auror, I understand that, and I'll cooperate fully. But the evidence doesn't change regardless of who presents it, and I'd like to see it through. Astoria was quiet for a moment. She had gray eyes and the quality of someone who thought very quickly and showed it very little. I'm not reassigning it, she said. You're my best. And frankly, given the public profile of everyone involved, I want my best on it. She picked up the charge recommendation again. I'm going to approve this. Formal charges will be issued today. The Wiesengemot will schedule a preliminary hearing within the fortnight. She looked at him. The family has not been formally notified. No. That changes today. Once I sign this, the formal notification process begins. They'll have 48 hours before it's a matter of public record. Harry nodded. Potter. She set the parchment down. When this becomes public, and it will, that profit leak is just the beginning, it's going to be significant. The Weasley family has an enormous amount of goodwill in this community. War heroes. Beloved. People are going to have a very difficult reaction to this, and some of that difficulty is going to point at you. She held his gaze. Are you prepared for that? I'm not doing this to be popular, he said. No, she said. I know. I'm asking if you're prepared for the specific experience of being the person who brought this case against the Weasley family, because that is a particular kind of pressure and I want to know you've thought about it. He had thought about it. He'd thought about it in the 3 hours he'd spent drafting the charge recommendation, and in the 15 minutes he'd stood outside his own house looking at the lights in the windows, and in every quiet moment since Nott had said a name in an interrogation room that Harry had not expected to hear. I'm prepared, he said. She picked up her quill. She signed it. The formal notifications went out by Ministry Owl at 11 o'clock. Harry knew they'd arrived when Robards appeared in his office doorway at 11:47 wearing an expression that said the flu had been busy. Arthur Weasley called my personal mirror, he said. Harry looked up from his desk. What did he say? He said he needed to understand what was happening and that there had to be a mistake. Robards was choosing his words very carefully. He paused. Confused. Genuinely confused. He didn't know, Harry said. His reaction suggested that, yes. Harry thought about Arthur Weasley, the man who had been more of a father to him than almost anyone, who had shown him what a good man looked like, who had a fundamental decency that Harry had never once questioned. He thought about what this morning had done to Arthur Weasley, what the owl with a ministry seal had delivered to a man who had no idea his own family had been doing this thing. He felt something shift painfully in his chest and moved through it. Tell him, Harry said, that the case is proceeding through proper channels and that I will speak to him personally after the preliminary hearing. Not before. He paused. And tell him I'm sorry he had to find out this way. Robards nodded and left. At noon, Priya found the intake leak, a junior administrative clerk who had a cousin at the Prophet and had passed the information on without fully understanding what it meant. Harry handed that to Robards to deal with and turned back to his preparations, because the preliminary hearing was the immediate priority and it required 3 things that weren't yet complete: the formal medical exhibit from Wells, the final financial analysis from Trevelyan, and the certified pensive memory documentation. He had all 3 by 2:30, which was a minor miracle of institutional efficiency that Harry credited entirely to the fact that everyone on his team had apparently decided, without needing to be told, that this case mattered in a way that made them work faster than they normally would. He was reviewing the final exhibit package when his office door opened without a knock. He looked up. Hermione closed the door behind her. She was in her work robes, her ministry identification on its lanyard, and she had the expression she'd had outside the pensive, clear, focused, and absolutely not here to be managed. She dropped a folder on his desk. The Research Division's complete archive of Fiorelli's theoretical framework, she said. Cross-referenced against known practitioners with the potion's proficiency to execute the formulation. I narrowed it to 14 people in Britain who could have made this specific blend. 12 of them can be eliminated through location or documented activity logs during the relevant period. She sat down across from him. The remaining 2 are Ginevra Weasley and a potions researcher in Edinburgh who died in 2002. Harry looked at the folder. Hermione. How did you get Research Division access? I have a standing research authorization through the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. It covers cross-departmental archive access for legislative research purposes. She looked at him with the expression of someone who knows a rule better than the person responsible for the rule. Everything I did was within my authorized access. The analysis is legally clean. She paused. It also eliminates the possibility that Ginny commissioned the blend from a third-party brewer. The formulation has specific signature characteristics that Wells identified in my blood work. They're consistent with a brewer working from the Fiorelli text directly, adapting the base formula using personal judgment. Whoever made this was working from first principles, not following a recipe. That means advanced skill and direct engagement with the theory. Harry looked at the folder, then at her. You've been working on this since last night. Since 3 this morning, she said, without apology. I told you, you told me I wasn't part of the investigation, she said. I'm not. This is independent research conducted through legitimate channels that I'm providing to the Auror office as a member of the public assisting an investigation. She met his eyes calmly. The distinction holds. He looked at her for a moment. The distinction was thinner than she was suggesting and both of them knew it, but it was a real distinction, and the research was clean, and it was genuinely useful. More than useful, it was the piece he hadn't been able to close, the question of whether Ginny had made the potion herself or had it made for her, and Hermione had just answered it with the precision of someone who had been thinking about nothing else. It's going in the exhibit package, he said. I assumed it would. She stood up. Where are you on the formal charges? Filed this morning. Notification went out at 11. He watched her face. They know. She absorbed that. She looked at the folder on his desk, then out his window at the grey London sky. Have you heard from any of them? Arthur called Robards. We don't have contact from Ginny or Molly yet. Their solicitors will advise them not to communicate directly. He paused. Ron called me. She looked at him quickly. He's not arguing it, Harry said. He's not defending it. He's processing it, which is going to take him a while. He looked at her steadily. He asked if you were all right. Something crossed her face. It wasn't soft, but it wasn't hard either. It was something more complicated, the face of someone feeling something they haven't yet decided what to do with. Tell him, she said, after a moment, that I'll talk to him when I'm ready. And that I don't know when that will be. I'll tell him. She nodded and moved toward the door. Then she stopped, and turned back, and said, Harry. The research I gave you, the narrowing to Ginny specifically. I need you to know I didn't build it to a conclusion. I followed the evidence. She held his gaze. I know what you're thinking. That it's not objective because it's me. But the methodology is sound and the results are what they are. I know, he said. I wouldn't have it any other way. She looked at him for just a moment longer, then left. He stared at the closed door for 5 seconds, then added the folder to the exhibit package and kept working. The preliminary hearing was set for the following Tuesday at 10 o'clock in courtroom 3. Harry received the scheduling confirmation and felt the case shift into its next phase with the particular finality of something being set in motion that couldn't be stopped. The Prophet ran its first story on Saturday morning. It was careful, whoever had written it was good enough to understand the legal implications of getting it wrong, but it had enough. Auror office files coercive potions charges against prominent wizarding family. No names yet, but the description was specific enough that anyone who knew the Weasley family and had access to the right social circles would be connecting the dots by lunchtime. The article was measured in tone, but the subtext was clear. This was significant, this was serious, and the wizarding public was about to be asked to hold two things at once that it would find very difficult to hold together. Harry read it over breakfast and thought, give it until Monday. He was wrong. It was Sunday. The Sunday edition of the Prophet had names. He found out from Priya, who sent a Patronus to his kitchen at 7 in the morning, a silver swift that burst through his window and said, in Priya's rapid, professional voice, Prophet Sunday edition, page 1. Weasley family named. Granger named as victim. We need to move. He was at the ministry by 7:30. The owls were no longer queued outside his window. They were queued in the corridor, managed by two junior clerks who were sorting them with wands and expressions of determined calm. The Floo was active with incoming calls that Priya was screening. Robards had already arrived and was on his own mirror in the corner office with the head of the Wisengamot, his voice low and steady. Harry stood in the middle of it and did what he always did in the middle of chaos. He identified the one most important thing. Get me Wells, he said to Priya. And get me Hermione. Hermione called in, Priya said. She says she's fine, she's already seen the paper, and she'll be here at 9. Of course she will. He felt something that in a lighter moment would have been a smile. Wells. Calling now. He went to his office, closed the door on the noise, and sat down. He needed to think, and he needed to do it in the next 2 hours, because once Hermione arrived and they were all in the same space with the story already running, the pace was going to accelerate and staying ahead of it was going to require everything he had. The problem with the story being out was not the case itself. The case was solid, the evidence was complete, the exhibit package was ready. The problem was the court of public opinion, which operated on entirely different rules and which the Weasley family's legal team would absolutely try to use. There would be character witnesses. There would be statements about family reputation and wartime service. There would, inevitably, be people who found it easier to disbelieve the crime than to revise their image of the people who'd committed it. Harry had seen it before with the Imperius cases. The particular resistance that communities showed when beloved people were accused of things that complicated beloved people's stories. He pulled out a piece of parchment and began writing a statement for the press, measured, factual, saying nothing about the evidence and everything about the process. Formal charges filed through proper procedure. Preliminary hearing scheduled through the Wisengamot. All parties have access to legal representation. The Auror Office's position is that every allegation is serious and every victim deserves the full operation of the law. He read it back. It was correct. It was also, he knew, going to satisfy no one. He sent it to the press office and began working on the preliminary hearing brief. Hermione arrived at 9 exactly, which he'd expected, and she arrived having clearly read every word of the Prophet article, which he'd also expected, and she arrived with something about her that he was still getting used to, a quality of presence that had been building since the pensive sessions, since the Hogwarts library, since the mug lifting off the table, that was simply more than it had been a week ago. She sat down across his desk and said, "The article names me as victim. I don't want to be described as a victim in any official documentation after this. Complainant, primary witness, whatever the legal terminology requires. Not victim." Complainant is the correct legal term, Harry said. That's what you are in all official documentation. Good. She put her copy of the Prophet on his desk, folded to the relevant page. The journalist got several things wrong. The dosing frequency calculation is incorrect, they have it as weekly rather than every 6 days, which sounds minor but affects the cumulative exposure figure in a way that undersells the severity. I'd like that corrected through the press office. I'll flag it. Also, the characterization of Class 3 compounds as minor restriction is incorrect. Class 3 is serious. Anyone reading that article and thinking this is a minor potions violation needs to understand otherwise. She looked at him. What do you need from me today? He looked at her across his desk. He thought about what Wells had said, about the voice that pushed back being strong enough that it had taken 6 years to muffle it. He thought about this woman in front of him, a week out from the worst thing she'd been told about her own history, and she was here, in his office, correcting a journalist's frequency calculation. "The preliminary hearing is Tuesday," he said. "Your role is limited, you're present as complainant, you're not testifying at the preliminary. That comes at the full trial. Tuesday is about establishing the charges formally and entering the evidence package." He paused. "But I want you prepared for what it's going to feel like to be in a room with Ginny and Molly." She met his eyes. "I'm prepared. Are you?" "I've been thinking about it since Thursday." She was quiet for a moment. "Molly, I think I can sit in a room with Molly and do what needs to be done. Because Molly's motivations, as much as I understand them, are at least legible. She wanted something and she took a terrible path to get it, and she never thought of me as separate enough from her family to ask my permission." She paused. "Ginny is harder." "Because Ginny understood you," Harry said. "Because Ginny is clever," Hermione said, "and she did it anyway. She sat in the Hogwarts library and she researched it. She understood exactly what she was doing and she did it with precision and maintained it for 6 years and," she stopped. She pressed her lips together for just a moment. "And she called me her friend the entire time." The office was quiet. Outside, the ministry was building toward the full noise of a Monday morning, but in here it was just the two of them and the weight of the thing between them. "She's going to be in that courtroom on Tuesday," Harry said. "With a very good solicitor. Her family can afford excellent representation, and the solicitor is going to do what solicitors do. Question the evidence, question the methodology, question your memory and your motives and whether the pensive sessions were conducted appropriately." He held her gaze. "You need to be ready to hear yourself described as someone with a motive to fabricate." Hermione looked at him. "I know. And you can't react." "Harry." Her voice was dry and sharp, an edge in it that he hadn't heard in a while, something quick and precise. "I sat in a room with Dolores Umbridge and didn't lose my composure. I sat in Malfoy Manor and didn't break. I think I can manage a courtroom." "I know you can," he said. "I'm saying it anyway. Say it every day if you want. It won't change the answer." She picked up the exhibit package from the corner of his desk and began reading through it with the systematic speed that still impressed him after 20 years. "The pensive certifications, Wells used the standard MML 47 form." "Yes." "Good. There's a Wisingamot ruling from 2000 that establishes MML 47 as the definitive standard for cognitive influence cases. Madam Justice Clearwater wrote the decision. She's on the current bench." She turned a page. "She won't be able to rule in the preliminary on that specific basis, but it establishes the evidentiary standard for the full trial." Harry stared at her. "How do you know Clearwater is on the current bench?" "I looked it up Friday morning." She turned another page without looking up. "I also read the sentencing guidelines for Class 3 conspiracy cases from 1990 to present to understand how the bench has historically weighted the various aggravating factors." She paused. "The custom formulation is the critical aggravating factor. Extended bioavailability demonstrates premeditation at a technical level that the bench consistently treats as the highest severity marker." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her, this extraordinary, unstoppable person reading through a legal exhibit package with the focused energy of someone who had simply decided that the full operation of her mind was required and had deployed it accordingly. "Hermione," he said. When did you last sleep?" "Saturday night. 6 hours." She turned another page. "That's adequate." "That is not, Harry." She looked up. "I am reading through the evidence package that represents the 6 years someone spent chemically limiting what I could think and feel and choose. I would like to do this, please." A pause. "I'll sleep on Wednesday." He let it go. By Monday afternoon, the wizarding world had opinions. This was predictable and Harry had predicted it, but the specific texture of the opinions was something he hadn't fully anticipated, not the division between belief and disbelief, he'd expected that, but the speed. Within 24 hours of the Sunday story, the public conversation had split into two distinct territories and was moving fast in both directions. One territory was outrage on Hermione's behalf. This was vocal, specific, and increasingly well-informed as the details leaked through various channels, people who understood coercive potions law, former Muggleborns who had their own complicated relationships with wizarding family dynamics, academics, healers, journalists who were better than the first reporter. They were angry in a way that had teeth. The other territory was something Harry found harder to deal with, because it wasn't simple denial. It was grief dressed up as doubt. People who had loved the Weasley family for 30 years, who had followed their wartime story, who had grown up on stories of their courage and warmth and fundamental decency, and who found it easier to question the evidence than to reconcile what it meant. Letters to the Prophet described Hermione as ambitious and ungrateful. Opinion pieces suggested that the Auror office was overreaching. One particularly unpleasant columnist suggested that Hermione had always wanted more than she was entitled to and was now using the legal system to punish a family that had given her everything. Harry read that last one and then set it face down on his desk and did not pick it up again. The more useful public development was when 3 former Hogwarts students came forward through the DMLE's public tip line to report their own experiences with suspicious food-related potions effects at various wizarding households. None of them were connected to the Weasley case, but the pattern they established, the use of family kitchens as dosing environments, the specific dynamic of controlling families using food as a delivery mechanism, was exactly the kind of contextual evidence that would matter to a jury trying to understand how this specific crime worked. Harry had pre-documented all 3 testimonies and flagged them for the trial preparation file. Trevelyan appeared in his doorway Monday evening with an expression that meant news. "The custom formulation," he said. "I followed the financial thread on the premium payment, the extra cost above market rate that we identified earlier. I wanted to know exactly what the premium was paying for. And the formulation included a specific ingredient, crystallized lethe water, very small quantities, insufficient for a memory charm but enough to mildly blur the sensation of the compliance effect itself." He let that sit for a moment. The dosing was designed not just to work but to be unfelt. The target wouldn't experience the compliance as external pressure. She'd experience it as her own thoughts. Harry was very still. Whoever designed this, Trevelyan said, was specifically concerned with the target noticing. They paid extra for undetectability. He paused. That's not just sophisticated. That's careful. Premeditation at the highest level, Harry said. The bench is going to see that lethe water component as the single most serious aspect of this case, Trevelyan said. It's the difference between someone making a bad decision in a moment and someone who sat down and thought, how do I make sure she never knows? Harry stood up from his desk. He walked to his window and stood there for a moment looking at the London evening, the darkening sky and the lit windows of 1,000 ordinary lives. He breathed steadily. He let the cold in him settle and hold. Add it to the exhibit package, he said. Full analysis. I want it front and center in the preliminary brief. Already done. After Trevelyan left, Harry stood at his window a while longer. He was thinking about Hermione, 2 years ago, ending her relationship with Ron. Describing it as mutual and inevitable. Coming to the end of something and not fully understanding why it had gone wrong or why she felt, afterward, not exactly freed but, as if she'd stepped into a room she'd forgotten existed and found the light still worked. He thought about that specific feeling, the way a thing makes sense in retrospect that had no clear name while you were inside it. She had come to the end of the cage on her own. Without knowing the cage was there. She had bumped against its edges and found them and done the thing her own instincts were telling her to do, finally, and had called it mutual and inevitable because those were the only words that fit from inside the experience. The lethe water had kept her from feeling the bars. But they'd been there. And she'd still pushed through them, eventually, by herself, because even at 65% with 6 years of carefully maintained chemical compliance and lethe water blurring the edges, she was still Hermione Granger. He picked up his wand from the desk. He cast a small, silent spell into the empty room, an old habit from the war years, just checking his own reflexes, feeling the magic move, making sure everything was where it should be. The spell left a brief gold trace in the air, lingering for a moment before it faded. He thought, Tuesday. He went home, slept 5 hours, and was back at his desk before the sun came up. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of autumn morning that stripped the air clean and made everything look very sharp at the edges. Harry walked into the ministry at 8:30 in his best aura robes, the exhibit package under his arm, and made his way to courtroom 3 with the steady unhurried step of someone who knew exactly what he was walking into and had decided, a long time ago, to walk in anyway. Hermione was already there. She was sitting in the complainants section, not the gallery, not the public area, but the formal complainants' chair to the right of the prosecution table, which was her right and which she had clearly known to claim. She was in formal robes, dark and precise, her hair pulled back, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She looked calm. Not the forced calm of performance but the real calm of someone who has already done the hard internal work and arrived at the courtroom with nothing left to dread. Harry sat down at the prosecution table and looked across the courtroom. The defense table was occupied by 2 solicitors in formal robes. The Weasley family had, as expected, retained excellent representation. One Harry didn't recognize. The other was Marcus Flint, now one of the more aggressive defense barristers in the wizarding world, who had the particular quality of someone who won cases not through elegance but through relentless pressure. Behind the defense table, in the family gallery, sat Arthur Weasley. Harry looked at him for a moment. Arthur looked older than he had at Christmas, the holidays felt like a different world entirely right now, and he looked as if the last several days had done something to him that time alone wouldn't fully repair. He looked like a man trying to sit in a room and hold 2 versions of his family in his head at once, and not managing it entirely. Harry met his eyes briefly. Arthur gave him a look that was not angry and not forgiving in not any single thing. It was the look of a man in the middle of something enormous who didn't yet know which way he was going to come out. Harry nodded once, slightly, and looked away. Ginny and Molly arrived with their solicitors at 2 minutes to 10. Harry watched them come in without turning his head, using the angled view from his position at the table. Molly looked smaller than he remembered, which he knew was an effect of context. She had always commanded a kitchen, a home, a table, and in those spaces she had seemed large with warmth and certainty. Here, in formal robes in a ministry courtroom, she looked like a woman in a place designed to make people feel the weight of what they'd done. Ginny looked like herself. That was what struck him. Not diminished, not broken, not the face of someone experiencing appropriate remorse. She walked in with her chin up and her eyes clear, and she sat down at the defense table with the body language of someone who was here to fight, and when her gaze moved across the courtroom and found Hermione's, something passed between them that Harry couldn't entirely read, complicated, old, the language of people who had known each other well and now found themselves on opposite sides of a thing that couldn't be uncrossed. Hermione held Ginny's gaze for exactly as long as she wanted to and then looked away, back to her folded hands, as if Ginny's gaze were something she'd examined and set aside. The Wisengamot justices filed in. The room stood. Harry stood, and looked at the bench, and felt the case settle into its formal shape around him, the evidence in his hands, the truth in the record, the full operation of the law now engaged and moving, and nothing left to do but see it through. The chief warlock cleared his throat, and the preliminary hearing of the Weasley case began. Chapter 5, Reckoning Courtroom 3 had seen a great many things in its long institutional life, Death Eater trials, post-war tribunals, cases that had bent the wizarding world's understanding of itself. The walls were old stone, the benches worn smooth, the air carrying that particular quality of accumulated gravity that only comes from decades of serious business conducted seriously. Harry had been in this room before, on both sides of the experience, as a 15-year-old facing a rigged hearing and as an aura presenting evidence he'd spent months building. He knew how it felt from both angles, and what he knew was that the room itself didn't care who you were when you walked in. It only cared what you could prove. The preliminary hearing had done its work efficiently. The charges were formally entered: conspiracy to administer Class 3 restricted compounds without consent, sustained over a period of 6 years, with the aggravating factor of custom formulation designed specifically for undetectability. Flint had challenged the pensive certifications and lost, because Madam Justice Clearwater had indeed authored the 2000 ruling establishing the MML 47 standard, and she was not going to watch someone argue against her own precedent in her own courtroom without consequence. The medical exhibit was entered over a second challenge, this one regarding Wells' methodology, which the bench had examined and accepted in its entirety. By the time the preliminary concluded, the charges were standing, the evidence was entered, and the trial date was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks that felt, to Harry, simultaneously too long and not long enough. The morning of the trial arrived with the specific quality of days that matter, not dramatic, not ominous, just very clear and very present. Harry was up before 5. He made coffee, read through the exhibit package one final time, not because he'd missed anything but because the ritual of it steadied him, then put on his formal robes and walked to the ministry in the early autumn dark. Priya was already at the prosecution table when he arrived at courtroom 3, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was that she'd brought an extra cup of coffee from the canteen and left it at his place without comment, which was the kind of thing that made him trust her more than any formal commendation could. Hermione arrived at 8:30. She had with her, in a leather folder, 43 pages of notes she'd prepared on the exhibit evidence, organized with color-coded tabs, which she set on the table and did not look at again. They were there as a grounding object, Harry understood, not a crutch. She looked at him when she sat down. "How are you feeling?" "Clear," he said. "Good." She straightened her robes. "Me too." The defense team arrived at 5 to 9. Flint again, and his junior, and 2 other solicitors Harry didn't recognize who had the look of people brought in specifically for the trial phase, careful, expensive, specialized. Ginny came in with them, and Molly behind her, and Arthur in the family gallery again, looking worse than he had at the preliminary, if that was possible, like a man being slowly taken apart from the inside. Ron was in the gallery too. Harry had known he'd come. Ron had told him 2 days ago, a short letter, 3 lines, saying he would be at the trial and that he understood what it meant and that he wasn't there for either side. Harry had read it and thought, "That's the most honest thing you've said about this," and had written back a single line acknowledging receipt. Ron sat in the gallery with his hands on his knees and his face doing the complicated, painful thing it had been doing since Harry had sat on his sofa and told him the truth. He looked at Hermione when she walked in and she did not look back, and the particular quality of that not looking was one of the harder things in the room to witness. The Wisengamot justices filed in. 7 of them for a case of this severity, standard bench for Class 3 conspiracy trials. Chief Warlock Aldous Pembridge presided, a tall man in his 70s with the careful, somewhat disappointed expression of someone who had hoped that human beings would be better by now and kept being surprised that they weren't. Clearwater was on his left, her presence in the room already a kind of precedent. The others Harry knew by reputation, 4 of them had sat on imperious cases, which meant they had specific experience with the coercive potions framework and knew what a sustained compliance case required in terms of proof. Pembridge called the room to order. His voice had the quality of old authority, not loud, not performative, simply final. This is the trial of the matter formally described as Ministry of Magic Auror Office vs. Weasley, M., and Weasley, G. On charges of conspiracy to administer restricted compounds without consent, under Section 14 of the Potion Restriction Act 1987 as amended. The complainant is Hermione Jean Granger. He looked at both tables. Opening arguments. Prosecution. Harry stood. He'd spent a week on the opening. Not because he needed a week to understand the case, he understood it in his sleep, every detail of it, every date and quantity and financial transaction, but because he needed to find the right language. Not the language of outrage, which would read as personal. Not the language of cold legal precision, which would make it abstract. The language of this is what happened, clear, factual, human enough that the bench could see the person inside the evidence. On the 9th of September 2001, he said, Hermione Granger accepted an invitation to Sunday dinner at the Weasley family home in Ottery St. Catchpole. She had done so many times before and would do so many times again. She sat at a table that had always felt like welcome, and she ate food that was given to her with what appeared to be warmth. He paused. Unbeknownst to her, that food contained the first of what would become 350 doses of a Class 3 restricted compliance compound administered over the following 6 years. He walked them through it systematically after that, the not testimony, the purchase records, the Hogwarts library access, the financial chain. Each piece presented cleanly, not embellished, the evidence allowed to carry its own weight. When he reached the medical evidence, Wells' assessment, the blood sample, the 65% magical capacity reading, he slowed down slightly and let the numbers breathe. Hermione Granger's magic was functioning at 65% of her known baseline capacity, he said. For the entirety of the relevant period. One of the most powerful witches in the wizarding world was operating, for 6 years, at 2/3 of herself. Not through illness. Not through choice. Through a sustained, deliberate, chemically maintained program that was specifically designed, I will present evidence of this specific design, to be undetectable. To feel, from the inside, like her own thoughts. He let that land. The prosecution will demonstrate, he continued, that this was not an impulsive act. It was not a single bad decision. It was a project, researched and executed over years, maintained with financial sacrifice and technical sophistication, with the specific purpose of keeping a person smaller than she was. The evidence will show who did it, why they did it, and precisely how they ensured it would not be noticed. He looked at the bench directly. We will ask this court to see it for exactly what it was. He sat down. Flint rose for the defense. He was very good. Harry had known he would be, had prepared for it, but good was still worth acknowledging. Flint's opening didn't deny the evidence, that would have been strategically incoherent given the preliminary, instead it built an alternate frame around it. He talked about context, about family dynamics, about the specific character of the wizarding families who had served in the war and come out of it with deep bonds and deep fears. He was careful not to say Hermione was lying. He said, in the elegant, gliding way of someone who had done this many times, the prosecution's interpretation of events is one interpretation among others. He was particularly interesting on the subject of Molly. He framed her as a woman who had been given something by her daughter under a false description, a wellness supplement, a calming preparation, something Ginny had characterized as harmless, and who had administered it in good faith. The loving matriarch misled by a child she trusted implicitly. Harry watched the bench as Flint made this argument. Pembridge's face gave nothing. Clearwater's gave slightly more, a particular tightening around the eyes that suggested she found the framing interesting but not persuasive. When Flint sat down, Pembridge said, the prosecution will call its first witness. Harry stood. The prosecution calls healer Orinthia Wells. Wells was, as Harry had always suspected she would be, excellent on the stand. She had the quality in a courtroom of someone whose expertise was so complete that challenging it felt like arguing with a wall, not because she was aggressive about it but because she was simply and thoroughly right and showed it through precision rather than volume. She walked through the blood analysis, the magical resonance scan, the pensive certifications. She explained the specific effect of the compliance blend on magical cognition, not a crude suppression, not something that removed Hermione's will, but something more insidious. The compound, she said, reduces the threshold at which external social pressure overrides internal preference. The subject's own desires and judgments become accessible to her but feel less urgent. Less authoritative. Like a voice she can hear but can easily talk herself past. She paused. The lethe water component is particularly significant. It creates a mild dissociative buffer around the compliance effect itself. The subject doesn't experience external control. She experiences a version of herself that simply weighs things differently. More accommodating. Less insistent. And the 65% magical capacity reading, Harry said. What does that mean practically? It means that for every spell she cast, every magical task she undertook, she was working against a chemical ceiling. Power she should have had available simply wasn't. Wells looked at the bench. I want to be very clear. This is not a metaphor. This is a measurable, documentable, medical fact. Her blood still carries residual markers. The suppression was real and it was profound. Flint cross-examined. He was good here too. He pushed on the question of whether the medical effects could have other explanations, whether the residual markers were definitively causal rather than correlative, whether Wells could say with absolute certainty that every behavioral change in the relevant period was attributable to the compound. Wells said, I can say with clinical certainty that the compound was present in the bloodstream at sustained levels consistent with the documented dosing schedule. I can say with clinical certainty that the neurological and magical effects I observed are consistent with and only with long-term compliance blend exposure. I cannot say, and I would not say, that I lived inside Ms. Granger's consciousness during the relevant period. What I can say is that the evidence is unambiguous about what was done and what it did. Flint moved on. He couldn't break her, and Harry watched him recognize that he couldn't break her, and watched him make the smart decision to limit the damage rather than press further. It was the right call, professionally. It didn't help the defense much, but it was right. Wells stepped down. Harry called Trevelyan next, who walked the bench through the financial analysis with the calm efficiency of someone who had built this trail brick by brick and knew where every single brick was. The 43 transactions, the Ginny Weasley account cross-reference, the premium payments for the custom formulation, the investment account liquidation. He was methodical and unshakable, and when Flint pushed on the account identification, Trevelyan produced 3 layers of financial documentation that made the challenge look, gently but clearly, like a waste of the court's time. After Trevelyan, Harry presented the Hogwarts library record. McGonagall had sent a formal witness statement rather than appearing in person. Harry had asked if she wanted to attend and she'd said, in the specific tone that meant she had strong feelings she was managing carefully, that her written statement would serve and that she preferred not to be in the same room as this particular matter. The statement was read into the record by Priya, and the name Ginevra Weasley and the title Fiorelli's Advanced Techniques in Extended-Release Magical Formulation sat in the courtroom air for a long moment after she finished. The lunch recess came. Harry, Priya, and Hermione ate in a small room down the corridor from the courtroom, sandwiches, barely tasted. Hermione spent most of the break reading and rereading the notes in her leather folder, not because she needed them, Harry thought, but because the action of reading gave her hands something to do and her mind a way to stay occupied. Her composure was complete and real, and it was costing her something to maintain it, and he knew better than to comment on the cost. This afternoon, she said, without looking up from her notes. This afternoon the bench hears Molly's testimony, Harry said. Then Ginny's. In that order. The prosecution has the discretion to order the witnesses. I want Molly first because her testimony establishes the context and the opportunity. Ginny's testimony is the central one. I want the bench already saturated with facts before they hear her. Hermione looked up. You think she's going to try to take sole responsibility? Harry had been thinking about this since the preliminary. I think Ginny is going to do the thing that's most strategically useful for the defense and most consistent with her actual psychology, he said. Which means she'll try to frame it in terms the bench finds comprehensible. Not denial. Reframing. She'll make it about protection, Hermione said. Yes. She'll say she was protecting Ron. Or the family. Or you, arguably. He met her eyes. Be ready for that version. Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Protecting me, she said. By chemically reducing my capacity to choose. Something moved across her face that was brief and controlled and very cold. I'll be ready. Molly Weasley took the stand at 2:00. She was administered Veritaserum by the court's designated potions officer, standard procedure in conspiracy cases where testimony was contested. She accepted it with a dignity that Harry found both admirable and deeply painful to watch, and then she sat in the witness chair and answered questions with the complete openness of a woman under truth serum and the specific quality of someone who, it emerged, had been carrying guilt in a place she hadn't examined directly for 6 years. Harry questioned her first. "Did you administer the compound to Hermione Granger?" "Yes," Molly said. "Did you know the compound was a Class 3 restricted substance?" A pause. The Veritaserum wouldn't let her evade, but it didn't force simplicity, it forced truth, which was sometimes complicated. "I knew it was something that needed to be kept quiet," she said, finally. "Ginny told me it was a calming preparation. She said it was used to help with stress, and settling, and that Hermione was struggling with anxiety she wouldn't seek help for." She looked down at her hands. "She said it wasn't harmful. She said it was the kind of thing you'd get from a healer if you went. She said the only reason to do it this way was that Hermione wouldn't accept help if you offered it directly because she was too proud." "Did you ask for the specific compound name?" "No." "Did you ask to see any documentation supporting your daughter's characterization of it?" "No." "You administered a substance to another person's food without their knowledge and without verifying what it was." Molly's eyes were very bright. She was not weeping. She looked like a woman who had arrived at the full weight of something and was not going to flinch from it in public, whatever she did in private. "Yes," she said. "Why?" The silence was long and full. "Because I loved that girl," Molly said, and her voice had something raw in it, something unpolished by the Veritaserum's removal of all social smoothing. "I loved her and I wanted her to be happy and settled, and I believed Ginny when she said it was help. I believed her because," she stopped. "Because it made it easier to believe," she said finally. "Because I wanted Hermione to be part of my family and I could tell she wasn't always content. And I should have asked her. I should have asked her directly what she needed instead of," her voice broke, slightly, and held. "I should have asked her." Harry looked at her for a moment. He thought about everything he'd built over the last 3 weeks, the evidence, the exhibit package, the careful legal architecture, and he thought about this woman sitting in a truth serum chair saying "I should have asked her," and he felt something complicated and didn't let it soften what came next. "You administered 350 doses," he said. "Over 6 years. You chose, 350 times, not to ask her." Flint's cross-examination tried to build on the good faith angle, Molly as a woman misled by her daughter, acting out of love rather than malice, never understanding the true nature of what she was doing. Under Veritaserum Molly couldn't be led, but the bench could hear the framing, and Flint was building it carefully. Molly confirmed she hadn't known the specific compound, hadn't known about the Fiorelli research, hadn't understood the legal classification. When Flint sat down, Pembridge looked at the bench. Clearwater leaned over and said something quietly to the justice on her right. Harry watched them and thought, they're noting the distinction between Molly's culpability and Ginny's. Good. That was exactly the distinction he needed them to note. Molly stepped down. She walked back past the defense table with her eyes straight ahead, and she did not look at Ginny, and that not looking was its own kind of testimony. Ginny Weasley took the stand at 3:15. She was also administered Veritaserum, and she accepted it with the same contained manner with which she'd entered the courtroom, upright, clear-eyed, not performing anything. Harry had watched enough people under Veritaserum to see the moment it took hold, the brief glassy interval before the eyes cleared, and he watched it take hold of Ginny and thought, here we are. He stood. "Did you research and formulate the compound administered to Hermione Granger?" "Yes." "Did you purchase the compound from a black market distribution network operating through Aldrich Knott?" "Yes." "Did you instruct Molly Weasley to administer it to Hermione Granger?" "I gave her what I told her was a calming preparation and I asked her to make sure Hermione got it with meals." "Yes." "You told your mother it was a calming preparation?" "I told her it would help Hermione with anxiety and stress." "I didn't give her the specific name." "Because if you'd given the specific name she would have known it was illegal." A pause. I thought she might question it, yes. So you chose a description that would make your mother compliant with your plan. Ginny's jaw tightened very slightly. I chose a description that was accurate enough. Accurate enough, Harry repeated. You spent time at the Hogwarts Restricted Library researching a specific formulation technique. You identified a custom blend with extended bioavailability specifically so that the compound would be harder to detect. You paid a significant premium for that custom formulation. You liquidated a personal investment account to maintain the dosing schedule over 6 years. He looked at her steadily. That is not the behavior of someone who thought they were administering a calming preparation. That is the behavior of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I knew what it did, Ginny said. Yes. Tell the court what it did. Another pause. The Veritasserum turned her face open, the way it turned everyone's face open, all the practiced social surface stripped away, the thing underneath showing plainly. It made her easier, she said quietly. Easier. Easier to be around. Easier to keep. She looked at the bench rather than at Harry, and her voice was even and careful in the way of someone choosing each word under compulsion with the last of their available agency. She was always going to leave. That was who she was. She was always looking at things beyond what we had, always, moving. Outward. Away. She paused. And Ron loved her. And you were afraid, Harry said. I was afraid she'd take him with her, Ginny said, and that she'd take all of it with her. The family. The shape of things. I was afraid that if Hermione Granger became the version of herself she was always heading toward, everything we'd built after the war would, she stopped. Fall away. The courtroom was very quiet. So you chose, Harry said, to chemically prevent her from becoming that version of herself. I chose to keep things stable, Ginny said, and the distinction she was drawing, between active harm and defensive stability, was audible and it was also, under Veritasserum, completely real. She had believed the distinction. She still believed it, some part of her. That was the most important thing in the room right now, and Harry felt the bench registering it. The lethe water component, he said. In the custom formulation. You specifically requested it. Yes. Why? A long pause. Because I didn't want her to feel like something was wrong, Ginny said. I didn't want her to feel controlled. I wanted her to feel like herself. You wanted her to feel like herself while being chemically prevented from being herself. Ginny was quiet. Yes or no, Harry said. Yes, Ginny said. He stepped back from the podium. He looked at the bench for a moment and then at his notes, not because he needed them but to give the answer room to exist in the air. One more question, he said. In 7 years of knowing Hermione Granger. In all the time you spent with her, researching this, planning this, maintaining this, did you ever consider simply talking to her? Telling her your fears. Asking her to stay. Ginny looked at him. Under the Veritasserum her face was completely open, and what was in it was not defiance and not shame, it was something more complicated than either. She would have left anyway, she said. She was always going to. That wasn't my question. Ginny looked at the bench. She looked at her hands. She said, quietly, no. I never considered it. Harry sat down. Flint's cross-examination was the best Harry had seen from him, focused, systematic, building the argument that Ginny's actions, while legally indefensible, were emotionally comprehensible in the context of post-war trauma, family preservation instinct, the specific panic of someone who had survived enormous loss and become pathologically afraid of further dissolution. He wasn't asking for acquittal. He was asking for understanding, the kind of understanding that affected sentencing. Harry watched the bench and thought they were listening, and thought that listening wasn't the same as accepting, and thought that Clearwater in particular had the expression of someone who understood the emotional argument perfectly and was not going to let it do the legal work Flint needed it to do. When Flint sat down, Pembridge said, "Does the prosecution have any further witnesses?" Harry stood. One more, Chief Warlock. The prosecution calls Ronald Weasley. The shift in the room was immediate, not dramatic, not theatrical, but real. The gallery stirred. Arthur put his hand over his mouth. Flint was on his feet in a moment. Chief Warlock, the defense objects, Ronald Weasley has not been listed as a witness in the formal documentation. Mr. Weasley contacted the prosecution this morning, Harry said, and volunteered to testify. He was added to the witness list under Emergency Provision 7, which the prosecution notified the defense of at 8:45 this morning. He looked at Flint steadily. I believe your team received the notification. Flint sat down, slowly, and his expression said clearly that his team had received it and that this was not welcome. Ron walked from the gallery to the witness stand with his hands loose at his sides and his face set in the specific way he'd had since they were 17, the look that meant he'd decided to do a hard thing and was not going to second-guess himself about it. He sat down in the chair. He was not administered Veritaserum. He had volunteered to testify, which under Provision 7 meant his testimony was unsworn and could not compel truth serum. But Harry knew Ron, and Harry knew that Ron, having decided to be honest, was going to be honest regardless of compulsion. Mr. Weasley, Harry said. During the period of the alleged dosing, did you notice changes in the behavior of Hermione Granger that you found unusual? Yes, Ron said. Can you describe those changes? Ron looked at the bench. His voice was steady. She was softer. More agreeable. She'd back down from arguments she used to push through. She'd change her mind about things, work things, plans, and the changed version never sounded right. Didn't sound like her. He paused. There was a job. In Geneva. She was excited about it and then she came to dinner at the Burrow and she wasn't excited about it anymore. And the reasons she gave for not taking it, I knew those weren't her reasons. I knew. He stopped. What did you do when you noticed? Harry said. Ron was quiet for a moment. Nothing, he said. I noticed something was wrong and I didn't ask about it because I was afraid if I asked the right question I'd get an answer I didn't want. He looked at his hands. That's the honest truth of it. I was scared. So I didn't ask. And I've got to live with that. Did you have any knowledge of the specific substance being administered to Ms. Granger? No. Did you have any reason to suspect illegal activity? Ron thought about this carefully. I had reason to suspect something wasn't right, he said. That's different. I had reasons to ask and I didn't ask. He looked directly at Harry, and in his expression was the full weight of the distinction he was drawing, not innocence, not guilt, but the specific and painful territory between them. That's what I can honestly say. Harry sat down. Flint had no questions for Ron. What would be the point? Ron had already said the most damaging things he could say about himself and there was nothing to pull on. Ron walked back to the gallery. He didn't look at Hermione. He sat down next to Arthur and Arthur put his hand on his son's arm and Ron looked at the floor. Hermione looked at Ron for a long moment from her seat at the complainant's table. Harry couldn't see her face from his angle, but he saw her shoulders, and he saw them settle slightly, as if something that had been braced could ease by a fraction now that it had been said plainly and publicly by the person who needed to say it. The closing arguments came at 5 o'clock, the late afternoon light pressing long and amber through the high courtroom windows. Harry stood and he said, clearly and completely, the evidence has shown that over a period of 6 years, Hermione Granger was systematically denied the right to be fully herself. Not through a single act of violence or a moment of cruelty, but through the sustained, deliberate, technically sophisticated application of a compound designed specifically to narrow the distance between who she was and who the defendants needed her to be. He looked at the bench. The prosecution does not ask this court to punish grief, or fear, or the complicated loves of complicated people. It asks this court to recognize that this, regardless of the emotional context surrounding it, was a choice, made and maintained and specifically engineered to be undetectable, and that choices of this magnitude, sustained over this time, against a person who was given no opportunity to consent or refuse, require the full response of the law. He sat down. Flint made his closing, full of the same competent architecture he'd built throughout the trial, the framework of post-war trauma and family panic, and a mother who had been misled and a daughter who had been afraid. It was genuinely moving in places, and it was the best version of the argument available. Harry respected it for what it was. When Flint finished, Pembridge called a recess. Harry walked out into the corridor and Hermione was beside him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, just stood in the stone corridor with the noise of the clearing courtroom behind them. The light was going soft and gold through the high ministry windows. "How do you feel?" Hermione asked. "Finished," he said. "In the right way." She nodded. She was very still, and in her stillness there was something different from the braced stillness of the morning, something more settled, more complete. As if the day had required something from her and she had given it and it had been enough. "Ron told the truth," she said. "Not a question." "He did." She was quiet for a moment. "I know it doesn't fix anything." "No. But it matters that he said it." She looked at the far end of the corridor. "Publicly. Under oath. Not because he had to." "Yes," Harry said. "It does matter." She looked at him then, and there was something in her face, not gratitude exactly, not relief exactly, something that sat between the two and was more specific than either. "You built something that held," she said. "You built it correctly and it held." "We built it," Harry said. She almost smiled. It was brief and real, and the particular quality of it, not performance, not bravado, just genuine, settled something in him that had been wound tight since the night in the interrogation room when an unremarkable criminal had said an unexpected name. They stood in the corridor and waited for the bench to return. Outside, London was moving through its ordinary late afternoon, and inside, the Wisengamot was sitting with the truth of what had been done, and 3 weeks of built and evidenced and carefully carried work was resting in the hands of people whose job it was to weigh it. Harry had given them everything. The rest was the law's to do. Chapter 6. After the fire, the Wisengamot deliberated for 2 days. Harry had expected one. The evidence was thorough, the charges were clear, the testimony had landed where it needed to land. 1 day felt right for a case this well documented. 2 days meant the bench was working through something more complicated than the facts themselves, the weight of who the defendants were, the particular difficulty of applying the law's full force to people whose names carried the specific gravity of wartime heroism and community love. Harry understood that. He didn't like it, but he understood it. He spent the first day of deliberation at his desk, catching up on 3 weeks of other work that had accumulated without apology while he'd been building the Weasley case. Priya managed the owls. Trevelyan filed his financial analysis into the permanent evidence archive. The ministry moved around him with its ordinary, relentless momentum, and Harry moved with it, because work was what he did when waiting was the only alternative, and waiting had never been something he was good at. Hermione worked too. He knew because she sent him a 3-page analysis of a creature protection bill she'd been neglecting, written in the precise, rapid script that meant she'd been at her desk since before 6 in the morning. He read it, made 2 notes in the margins, and sent it back without comment on the timing. She didn't need him to note the timing. The second day of deliberation was harder to fill. He'd cleared the backlog. The case preparation was done. There was nothing to do with his hands and his mind except think about what was happening in the deliberation chamber, which was useless, because he couldn't affect it and he'd given it everything available to give. He went for a long walk instead, which he almost never did. He was a person who moved with purpose, from one place to another place, and aimless movement didn't usually appeal to him. But the October air was cold and very clean, and the city had that quality it got in autumn when the leaves were turning and the light went early, and he walked through it for 2 hours without a destination and thought about things he hadn't had space to think about during 3 weeks of building a case. He thought about the borough. About the specific warmth of it, which had been real, he was certain of that. The warmth had not been manufactured, had not been part of the design. Molly Weasley had genuinely loved Hermione in her way, the possessive, encompassing way she loved everyone she claimed, and the love had been real even when the things she'd done with it had been terrible. Harry wasn't sure that made anything better. He suspected it made it worse, in certain specific ways. He thought about Ginny's face under Veritaserum, saying she was always going to leave anyway. The particular thing that sentence had contained, not cruelty, not coldness, but a kind of grief that had gone rotten. Grief for a version of things that had existed only in someone's head, a version where Hermione stayed small and grateful and the family remained the shape it had been. Ginny had been protecting a fiction and she'd used a real person to do it. He thought about Ron saying I noticed something was wrong and I didn't ask. The specific honesty of that, the specific courage of saying it in public when silence would have been more comfortable. He thought about how Ron's failure had been a different kind of failure from Ginny's and Molly's, not action but inaction, not design but avoidance, and how that difference mattered legally and also how it didn't fix the 6 years of not asking. Both things were true. He thought about Hermione standing in his office doorway the morning after the trial's first day, looking out his window at the ministry atrium below, and the quality of the light on her face, and the way she turned and said, quietly, I had a dream last night where I took the Geneva position. Just that. No elaboration. He'd said, tell me about it, and she'd sat down and described the dream with the specific, careful pleasure of someone who was trying something out, testing how it felt in the mouth. The Geneva position no longer existed. 3 years gone. But there were other positions. There were always other positions, for someone with her particular combination of gifts, and the wizarding world was considerably more open than it had been 6 years ago, and Hermione Granger was, becoming something. He'd been watching it happen in real time since the mug had lifted off her kitchen table and he was still not quite prepared for the scale of it. He walked until the cold got properly serious, then turned back toward home. The owl arrived at 7:30 on the morning of the third day. He was still in his kitchen with his coffee when it came through the window, a formal ministry owl, grey and severe, carrying a sealed envelope with the Wisengamot crest. He set his coffee down and opened it with steady hands. He read it once. Then he read it again, not because he hadn't understood the first time but because it deserved the full attention of 2 readings. Then he picked up his mirror. Hermione answered on the second pulse. She was clearly already up, already dressed, already, from the look of the background, at her kitchen table with papers around her. She looked at him and went still. They're back, she said. 10 o'clock, he said. Courtroom 3. A pause. Both of them. Yes. She looked at him through the mirror for a moment. He couldn't read everything in her expression, there was too much in it, layered and specific in the way that things felt when you'd been waiting for them for a long time and they'd finally arrived. Then she said, I'll be there at 9:30, and ended the call. He got dressed in his formal robes, ate 2 pieces of toast he didn't taste, and went to the ministry. The courtroom filled differently than it had for the trial. The public gallery was open for the verdict, and it was used. Harry had expected some attendance but not quite this, the quiet, orderly crowd that had filed in by 9:45, witches and wizards he didn't know alongside people he did, ministry colleagues and journalists with their quick quotes quills already out and several faces he recognized from the letters that had been sent to the prophet over the last 3 weeks. Both sides of the public conversation, sitting in the same room, waiting for the same thing. Arthur was in the family gallery again. He looked like a man who had slept badly for 2 weeks and had stopped expecting to sleep well for a while yet. Ron was beside him. They sat with the particular stillness of people who had been through something together and had found, in the going through, a specific closeness that was different from what they'd had before, not better exactly, but more honest, which was its own kind of value. Ginny and Molly were at the defense table with Flint. Neither of them had spoken publicly in the 3 weeks since the trial, no statements, no press appearances, no letters to the prophet. Harry had respected that, pragmatically, because public statements during deliberation were a risk and Flint was too good to let his clients take unnecessary risks. Hermione sat at the complainant's table with her leather folder, which she opened to the first page and did not look at. Harry sat beside her, which was not standard procedure. The prosecution table and complainants section were technically separate, and when Priya raised an eyebrow at him, he looked back at her with an expression that said clearly, "Not today, not this particular thing." Priya moved slightly to make room and said nothing further. Hermione didn't comment on it either. She just looked at the bench and waited. The Wisengamot filed in at 10 exactly. Pembridge looked, if possible, more tired than he had at the start of the trial. The weight of 2 days of deliberation was visible in the set of his shoulders and in the careful way he arranged himself in his chair, as if he were managing something that had been heavy to carry and needed to be set down precisely. Clearwater was beside him, her expression professionally unreadable in a way that told Harry she had opinions and had formed them decisively and was waiting for the correct moment to give them their due weight. Pembridge looked at the room. The room settled. "This court has deliberated on the matter of Ministry of Magic Auror Office versus Weasley, M., and Weasley, G., he said, and has reached verdicts on all counts." The room was completely silent. The kind of silence that has texture. On the charge of conspiracy to administer Class 3 restricted compounds without consent, sustained over a period of 6 years, against the person of Hermione Jean Granger, Pembridge looked at the defense table. "In the matter of Ginevra Molly Weasley, this court finds the respondent guilty." The gallery made a sound. Not loud, more like a collective exhale, a room releasing something it had been holding. Flint's face was still. Ginny's face did not change, which Harry thought was either tremendous composure or the specific kind of stillness that comes when you've already made your peace with a thing. On the same charge, in the matter of Molly Weasley, Pembridge continued, this court finds the respondent guilty, with the significant mitigating factor of demonstrable deception by a correspondent, which this court determines substantially reduces the degree of culpability. Flint sat very slightly forward. The distinction mattered. The bench had separated them. Harry had expected this and he was satisfied with it. It was legally correct and it was the truth. On the charge of procurement of illegal compounds through a black market distribution network, Pembridge said, looking at Ginny specifically now, this court finds the respondent guilty. On the charge of deliberate concealment of the nature of restricted compounds from a correspondent in order to secure illegal administration, this charge was directed at Ginny with respect to Molly, this court finds the respondent guilty. 4 guilty verdicts for Ginny. 1 for Molly, significantly mitigated. Pembridge set down the parchment he'd been reading from and looked at the defendants directly. "Before this court proceeds to sentencing," he said, "Madam Justice Clearwater will address the aggravating factors." Clearwater stood. She had a quality in these moments. Harry had seen her at 3 previous trials and it was consistent, of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and had arrived at it without impatience. She looked at Ginny Weasley with the direct, undramatic attention of someone about to say something important simply. "This court has considered the question of aggravating factors at length," she said. "The prosecution identified the lethe water component of the custom formulation as the primary aggravating factor, and this court concurs. The deliberate modification of the compound to prevent the victim from perceiving the nature of her own compliance represents a qualitative degree of premeditation that this court cannot treat as equivalent to other coercive potions cases. In this case, the respondent did not merely override the victim's will. She engineered circumstances in which the victim could not recognize that her will was being overridden." She paused. "That distinction is the difference between a serious crime and a profound one." The room was completely still. The extended duration, Clearwater continued, the financial sacrifice maintained over 6 years, the deliberate deception of a correspondent to secure consistent administration, the specific research conducted to optimize the formulation's undetectability, each of these elements individually would constitute an aggravating factor. Together they describe an act of premeditated, sustained, and technically sophisticated violation of another person's autonomy. She sat down. Pembridge looked at his bench colleagues briefly, then back at the defendants. "Ginevra Weasley, please stand." Ginny stood. She was very upright. Her hands were loose at her sides and her face was calm in the way that had been constant throughout the trial, not indifferent, but composed, the composure of someone who had chosen their actions knowing consequences existed and was not going to perform surprise at their arrival. "This court sentences you to 7 years in Azkaban," Pembridge said, "with eligibility for review at 4 years, conditional on demonstrated rehabilitation and full compliance with the Potions Monitoring Act provisions that will be attached to your release conditions. Additionally, you are permanently prohibited from purchasing, possessing, or administering any Class 3 or above restricted compound. Violation of this prohibition carries automatic extended sentence." He looked at her steadily. "You are also required to provide a full and public accounting of the formula used, including all modifications, to the Ministry Potions Registry within 30 days, so that the formulation may be formally catalogued and detection protocols updated." Ginny sat down. Flint put a hand briefly on her arm. "Molly Weasley, please stand." Molly stood. She looked older than she had at the start of the trial. Not diminished, she was not a woman who diminished easily, but as if the full weight of things had settled on her, not crushed her but pressed her into a new and more burdened shape. "In consideration of the significant mitigating factor of deception by a correspondent," Pembridge said, "and in consideration of this court's finding that your culpability, while real, was materially reduced by the concealment of the compound's true nature, this court sentences you to 3 years of supervised probation, with mandatory quarterly assessments by a certified potions examiner. You are prohibited from administering any substance to another person's food or drink without their explicit knowledge and consent for the remainder of your life. Violation of this condition carries immediate imprisonment." He paused. "This court additionally orders that you complete a formal program in consent and coercive potions law, in recognition that the law was violated through your hands regardless of the circumstances of your knowledge." Molly nodded once, the single precise nod of someone accepting something without flinching. Then she sat down, and her hands came to rest in her lap, and Harry looked at her for just a moment and saw a woman being quietly rearranged by consequence. Pembridge set down his final parchment. "This court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The noise in the room after was not loud or dramatic. It built slowly, the gallery beginning to move, conversations starting, the press section erupting in a quiet frenzy of quills. Flint was already talking quietly to Ginny in his professional, controlled way. Arthur stood up in the gallery and for a moment simply stood there, his hands at his sides, looking at the room around him with the expression of a man trying to locate himself in something he thought he understood. Ron stood beside him and said nothing, and the two of them stood there together in the gallery for a long moment before they slowly began to move toward the aisle. Harry looked at Hermione. She was sitting very still. She had both hands flat on the table in front of her, the leather folder closed, her eyes on the bench where the Wisingamot justices were gathering their things and exchanging quiet words. Her composure was complete and it was real, and Harry sat beside her and waited, because this moment was hers to spend however she needed and he was not going to rush it. After perhaps a full minute, she said, 7 years. Yes. With review at 4. Yes. She looked at her hands. It's right, she said, quietly, and he thought she was talking to herself as much as to him, checking the thing against her own sense of it, making sure the number sat correctly. It's not revenge. It's the appropriate legal response to what was done, and that's, she stopped. That's what I wanted. The right response, not the satisfying one. Are they the same? He asked. She thought about that for a moment. I think so, she said. Or close enough that the difference doesn't matter. She looked up from her hands. Ask me again in a month. He almost smiled at that. I will. She looked at him then, really looked at him, with the specific directness she had when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for a while. I need to talk to Ron. I know. Not today. But soon. He'll be ready when you are. I don't actually know if I'm doing it for him or for me, she said. Both, probably. But I need to say some things and I need him to hear them, and then I need to decide what's left after that. She paused. If anything is. Harry nodded. He didn't tell her what to do with that. He didn't tell her it would be fine or that Ron deserved another chance or that the friendship was too old and too deep to throw away. He didn't tell her any of the easy things, because she wasn't asking for easy things and he respected her too much to offer them. "There's something else," she said. He waited. "The Department of International Magical Cooperation contacted me 3 weeks ago. While the trial was ongoing." She looked at the far end of the courtroom. "A position. Not Geneva, that one's long gone. But similar in scope. Coordinating international creature rights legislation across 5 countries. Based partly in London, partly in Brussels, with travel." She paused. "It's exactly what I've always wanted." He looked at her. "When did they contact you?" "October 12th. She met his eyes. 3 weeks ago. "And you've been sitting on it while the trial was happening." "I needed to finish one thing before I started another." She said it simply, as if the logic were self-evident, which for Hermione it probably was. "Are you going to take it?" he said. She looked at him with an expression he recognized, the one she'd had in her office the morning after the interrogation, when she'd stood up and picked up her wand and looked at him with the face of someone who had already measured the wall and decided to clear it. "Yes," she said. "Obviously." He felt something move through him that was warm and clean and, proud was the word, though it felt insufficient. He was proud of her in the specific way you were proud of someone who didn't need your pride but who had earned it so completely that not feeling it would have been dishonest. "Good," he said. She nodded once. Then she gathered her folder, straightened her robes, and stood up. Harry stood with her, and they walked out of courtroom 3 together the way they'd walked into every hard thing since they were 11 years old, side by side, without ceremony. The corridor outside was fuller than it had been before the trial, people moving, journalists positioning themselves near the exits, ministry colleagues who had followed the case and wanted to say something now that it was over. Harry navigated it with the practiced ease of someone who had been famous and inconvenient since childhood, deflecting with a word here and a brief nod there, keeping moving. Hermione stopped once, near the corridor's midpoint, when a woman Harry didn't recognize touched her arm briefly, 50s, with the look of someone who had come specifically for this, not a journalist, not a ministry employee, just a person who had needed to be present. She said something to Hermione quietly, too quiet for Harry to hear. Hermione listened, and her face went still for a moment and then soft in a very specific way, the way it went soft for things that genuinely reached her. She said something back, equally quiet. The woman nodded and moved on. Harry raised an eyebrow when Hermione fell back into step beside him. "She was dosed," Hermione said simply. "Different family, different circumstances, several years ago. She said she followed the case because she needed to see it happen." She paused. She said thank you. Harry looked ahead down the corridor and said nothing for a moment. Then, Trevelyan flagged 3 similar cases during the investigation. Different families, different targets, same general pattern. Coercive potions administered through food by controlling relatives. He glanced at her. The Potions Monitoring Act provisions are being reviewed in light of this case. Clearwater has already been in contact with the Department of Magical Law Enforcement about broadening detection requirements. "Good," Hermione said. "That's, yes." She said it with a particular satisfaction, the satisfaction of someone who was thinking 3 steps past the immediate thing to the structural change it might produce. "I want to read the proposed review when it's drafted. I'll send it to you." "Send it to my new office," she said, and there was something in her voice, light, slightly rueful, the tone of someone letting themselves have a thing they'd been careful about for too long. Harry looked at her sideways. "You've already told them yes." "I called them this morning," she said, without apology. "Before the verdict. I knew what the verdict was going to be." He laughed. It was brief and genuine and it surprised him slightly, the way genuine laughter sometimes did in the middle of serious things, not inappropriate, just human, the relief of something real cutting through. She glanced at him and almost laughed too, something in her expression flickering briefly into the lighter, sharper version of itself. They reached the main atrium. The ministry was moving through its afternoon business around them, people crossing the floor, the fountain in the center catching the light, the ordinary extraordinary machinery of an institution that kept functioning through everything. Harry stopped at the edge of the atrium. "I'm going to go back to my office," he said. "There's paperwork." "There's always paperwork." "There's always paperwork," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. The case was over, in the specific sense of the law's work being done, but the things it had uncovered and changed and set in motion were not over, they were just beginning, and both of them knew it, and the knowing sat between them easily rather than heavily. "Dinner," he said. "Thursday. Not a debrief, not case-related. Just, dinner." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to read entirely, which was unusual. He could almost always read her. This was something new, or something old that was showing its face differently, and he held it without trying to name it. "Thursday," she said. "My choice of restaurant." "Absolutely not. Last time you chose somewhere that required a full week's reading of the menu. It was interesting. It was in a language I don't speak. That's a personal limitation." "Thursday," he said. "I'll choose." She smiled at him then, properly, the full version, the one she didn't perform but that arrived when she was actually pleased about something. It changed her face entirely. It had always done that, and he had always noted it without particularly doing anything with the noting, and right now in the ministry atrium with the case finished and the verdict in and her new position already accepted and her magic currently stronger than it had ever been in his experience of her, he noted it again and let himself, for the first time, simply sit with what the noting felt like. It felt like something that had been a long time coming. "Thursday," she said, and turned and walked toward the lifts. He watched her go. She moved through the atrium with the ease and authority of someone fully comfortable in their own space, not performing it, not announcing it, simply occupying herself completely, and the magic around her had that quality he'd been noticing for weeks now, the faint texture of something large and awake and entirely her own. He turned back toward the lift to his own floor and caught Priya in his peripheral vision, coming across the atrium with her parchment under her arm and the efficient half-walk she used when she needed to catch him in transit. "Sentencing report needs to be filed by end of day," she said, falling into step beside him. "I'll have it done in an hour. Robards wants a debrief tomorrow morning. Tell him 9 o'clock. The prophet wants a statement. They always want a statement. Tell them what I told them at the start, the law operated, the evidence was examined, the court reached its determination. If they want more than that they can read the transcript." Priya noted this. "Also," she said, in a slightly different tone, "Evangeline sent a message up from the archive. She said, and I'm quoting, 'Tell him they found it.'" Harry stopped walking. "Found what?" "She didn't say. She said you'd know." He thought for a moment. Then he did know. The intake leak, the junior administrative clerk who'd passed the Sunday story to the prophet. He'd asked Priya to find them and had given it to Robards to manage, and then the trial had consumed everything and he'd let it slide to the back of his attention. "Is it handled?" he said. Evangeline seemed to think so. "Then it's handled." He started walking again. He filed the sentencing report in 50 minutes and sent it to Robards' office before 4 o'clock. He cleared his desk of the last of the Weasley case documentation, every file, every exhibit copy, all of it going to the permanent archive where Evangeline would catalog it with the precise, respectful attention she gave to things that had mattered. He kept nothing. The case was done and his desk was better empty for whatever came next. He sat in his cleared office for a moment after, in the quiet late afternoon, and let himself be still. He thought about not in the interrogation room, saying a name Harry hadn't expected. He thought about the cold that had settled in him then and that had carried him through 3 weeks of the hardest professional work he'd done since the war. He thought about what Robards had asked him, "Can you handle this, given your history with the family," and what he'd answered, and what it had cost to make that answer true. He thought about the burrow, standing empty right now, he imagined, Arthur with Ron somewhere, Ginny beginning the process of whatever came next, Molly in the house she'd filled with warmth that had been both real and terrible. He thought about Percy, who had sent him a formal letter 2 weeks ago expressing legal cooperation and personal devastation in precisely measured sentences. He thought about George, who had sent no letter at all, and whose silence Harry had found more eloquent than most statements. He thought about what would remain of the Weasley family when all of this was through. He wasn't sure. Families had survived worse than exposure, or perhaps that wasn't right, perhaps they hadn't, perhaps what came out the other side was something new that shared certain features with the old thing but wasn't it exactly. He didn't know. He had done the work the law required and it was done and the rest was theirs to carry. He thought about Hermione. He thought about the job in Brussels, and the new office, and the case she was going to build over the next several years, because she would build a case, something large and important and specifically her, in a field that would have the full benefit of her at 100% of herself, magic and mind and will and the particular brilliant stubbornness that had kept her alive through a war and through 6 years of chemical suppression and through the last 3 weeks of sitting in a courtroom and watching the truth be made into law. He thought about Thursday. He thought about the way she'd said Thursday and turned and walked away and the specific quality of not looking back that was, deliberate, he thought. Not avoidance. More like someone choosing the timing of a thing with care. He picked up his wand from the desk. He turned it once between his fingers, a habit, an old comfort, the familiar weight of it. Then he put on his coat, picked up his bag, and walked out of his office, down the long ministry corridor, out through the atrium, and into the October evening. The air was cold and very clear. The trees in the small park beside the ministry entrance had gone fully gold, and the light was low and amber and slanted across everything at the particular angle it only reached in October, making the ordinary world look, briefly, like something worth paying attention to. He stood on the pavement for a moment. Somewhere across the city, Hermione Granger was in her flat with her leather folder open and her notes spread across her kitchen table, reading through the terms of an appointment that would take her exactly where she'd always been going. Her magic was waking up by degrees. Her mind was fully her own. Her choices, from this point forward, would be made by no one but her. He thought, that's everything. It was. It was everything, the only thing that had ever mattered in the whole of it, not the case, not the verdict, not the sentencing or the evidence or the cold purpose that had driven him through 3 weeks of the hardest work. All of that had been in service of this one specific thing, Hermione Granger, fully herself, stepping forward into whatever she decided to do next. He put his hands in his pockets and started walking home through the gold October light, and he was already thinking about Thursday.